Welcome to the Northern Myths podcast, where we explore the myths and legends of Northern Europe from an archetypal perspective. I'm Dan Larrabee.
And I'm Luke DeWolf.
Well, welcome to the podcast. Today we'll be continuing our series on the Poetic Edda, and we will be looking at one of the more interesting, and it's funny, it's a kind of a famous poem, but at the time, sort of back in the day, it wasn't one of the favored poems for people to hear because it's dark and kind of upsetting, actually. But we'll be looking at the Lokasenna, and it's basically a dinner party that Loki ruins.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, it's we're going to be hearing lots of great insults and some things that would certainly in the time break many rules of hospitality and would be worthy of severe beatings and possibly death. Outlawry for sure. And the only other thing I'll add about this, just for context, is that it's kind of a neat poem because it's done in the fashion of like a wisdom poem, so like Grimnus Mall, where you have people sort of trading information, but it's also flighting, so like a rap battle where they're insulting each other. And spoiler alert, Loki is the sort of the best one at it. No surprise there. That's sort of his deal. But before we dive in, I think we should probably mention where people can reach us and find us on online. So we've got Facebook, Northern Myths Podcast, Twitter at Northern Myths. We're on Twitter as well ourselves at Northmyth Dan, at Northmyth Luke, on Instagram at Northern Myths Podcast. And absolutely get in touch with us, like, share, subscribe, comment. We love interacting with people. As we always say, we're not experts in this. We're just sort of going through this so that we can learn. And, people out there usually have really awesome things to add. So absolutely get in touch and share what you think.
Yeah, definitely. And on all this social media, it's all there. It's a great way to help spread the word about the show. So we always appreciate a share, a subscribe, anything like that. Definitely appreciate it. We also have a couple of ways you can support the show if you'd like to as well. We've got a merchandise store available now with some t-shirts and mugs. And we've got an Amazon affiliate program with links to some of our favorite books, recommended books, and music as well, now that we've been having a few musical guests on the show too. And with all that, just a little bit goes towards us if you make a purchase through those links. So those are just great ways to support the show if you so choose.
Absolutely. And just as we're about to dive in here, I'll mention that we're using the Poetic Edda, and it's translated by our friend Dr. Jackson Crawford and published by Hackett Publishing, and they've been kind enough to give us permission to use it. So, a big shout out to them and a big thank you to them for letting us use it. It's if this is your first episode where we're doing a Poetic Edda story, the translation's fantastic. Dr. Crawford really struck the balance between meaning and readability to make it make sense in English, because you could, if you were to just do like a dry translation, it wouldn't be nonsensical, but it wouldn't make that much sense for the modern reader. So, having said all that, I think we'll dive right in. And again, we're doing the Lokasenna, and it begins with sort of a large paragraph of prose to set the stage, and then sort of get into the nasty stuff. Aegir, also called Gymir, prepared ale for the gods after he had acquired the great kettle, which has been told of. Odin came to the feasting with Frigg, his wife. Thor did not come, since he was out east, but Thor's wife Sif was there. Bragi came with his wife Ithun. Tyr was there as well. He was one-handed because Fenrir had bitten his hand off when he was chained. Njorth was there with his wife Skavi and his children, Frey and Freya. Vidar, son of Odin, was there. Loki was there, and so were Frey's servants, Bigvir and Bela. There were many other gods and elves as well. Aegir had 2 servants, Fimifeng and Eldir. Shining gold lit the hall, and the beer served itself. It was a great place of peace, and everyone praised how good Aegir's servants were. Loki could not tolerate hearing good things said about servants, and so he killed Fimifeng. Then the Aesir shook their shields at Loki and shouted at him, and drove him out into the forest, and went back to drinking. But Loki came back, and in the darkness outside he met Eldir. Loki said, "Tell me, Eldir, before you take another step forward, what are the gods sitting in there talking about over their beer?" Eldir said, "They are comparing their weapons and judging their readiness for war. Of the elves and gods sitting inside, not one is your friend." Luke, what does that mean?
Well, Dan, this is a fantastic introduction to this, as you mentioned, very interesting poem, very different. Sets the stage with all the characters here, and we'll talk more about each individual one that's being mentioned here in this prologue. Very good for setting the stage, though. This is everyone that we're going to meet and talk to. It's related to not related to it, it's almost immediately after the previous poem, Hymiskvida, which is the Thor's fetching of the cauldron. That was a really fun episode. If you haven't listened to that one, that's really enjoyable. We enjoyed that story quite a bit. That's a kind of traditional heroes story with Thor fetching the cauldron from the giants, and there's lots of occasion for him to use his hammer. But now Thor is away, he's not around, and they're having this feast. The gods are having this feast. And Loki, as seems to be kind of tradition, he is the one who ruins it. But this time he ruins it in a pretty bad way. The most interesting thing about this poem, I'll just say here to me, is that Loki really comes off nasty in this entire thing. And in other poems, he's got a role to play. He's got a role to play, and he usually ends up contributing in some positive fashion. And so, the gods keep him around because he's useful to have, and that has symbolic connotations, just saying, which we will touch on. But the other thing about that, though, is that he is still kind of one of the gods. He's not this big enemy sort of thing here. But I guess in this particular instance, things take a turn. And whether or not this is influenced by any sort of intentional attempt to portray Loki negatively, I don't really want to speculate on that. At a minimum here, he takes a turn from being oriented towards the gods in his own chaotic manner to being essentially their enemy. Not really to spoil anything, but he starts by killing someone at a feast. That's breaking the peace in one of the most drastic ways possible, right? And yeah, this is just not going to go well at all. And then he goes outside, comes back, speaks to this Eldir servant, and what Eldir says is really interesting, that the gods are comparing their readiness for war or something like that, right? And this is to say the gods are actually setting goals for themselves. They're comparing each other to one another. They're preparing for Ragnarok ultimately, which is, we've talked about this before, this major event that's going to, be the end of the world and the death of many of the gods, right? But they're still preparing for it. They're still doing what they have to. And Loki, I think, is one of those gods who just does not care for that. He doesn't necessarily care to be the one who's preparing for war, for whatever. He's, based on his behavior elsewhere, but also in this poem, he appears to not kind of be aligned with that. And so it's kind of right to say that, no one sitting inside is his friend, because I don't think he is with them in that goal, in the goal of preparing for war, of setting standards and trying to better himself. I don't think he's up for that, is what this kind of implies. Now, killing the servant, that's also pretty bad, but the but the overarching theme here is to, I think, kind of set the tone of what Loki's behavior and character is like. I think that's the case for this entire poem. And to start off with something like that, where Loki is in contrast with the gods who are really trying to build a society, for lack of, well, not for lack of, but just to simplify things a little bit. Yeah, so Loki stands in contrast to that, and he's outside in the woods because he broke the peace.
Absolutely. It's almost a form of outlawry where they cast him out because, killing your host's servant, like on a scale of like hospitality, that's one of the worst things you could do. And it comes down to, it's a servant, right? So it's destruction of your host's property, essentially. But that's still a big deal. Like, I think the only worse things you could do in terms of hospitality would be like killing family members or, stealing the host's wife or something like that, or killing the host's wife, like along those lines. But so this is a major infraction, and you're very right. We do see a weird. I don't know if it's weird, but we see a turn in Loki from sort of the mischief maker who, does these things, but at the end of the day makes it right for the gods, and they're all able to like drink and have fun at the end. And he kind of goes between like trickster and comic relief. But here he takes a turn and kind of, he goes too far, essentially. And they don't attribute too much motive to Loki, which is something I find kind of maybe sad or frustrating, because, we always want to know, like, why do people do bad things, right? They give a bit of a clue here, saying he couldn't stand to have a servant praised. But is that, like, to me, that's not like a good enough reason for him to do what he's about to do. But at the same time, I wonder if that's kind of a bitterness in him that, and we don't necessarily know why he has that bitterness, but there is that bitterness that, oh, someone else is getting attention, and they're not a god, so I can kill them, without the ramifications of killing a god. But it's interesting that we go from sort of Loki, the trickster, mischief maker, scoundrel type character, to like full on, like he's about to basically burn all the bridges with the gods and align himself with the outside. I've got a few translations for the names that are kind of interesting. So Fimafeng, the servant that Loki kills, the name means quick servant. So no wonder he was being praised, because he was, quick with the drinks and the food and doing whatever else needed to be done. Elder means fire stoker, which is sort of another job that a servant would do. He's making sure people are warm, the fire is fed, and it's cooking meat and warming broth, all that good stuff. Big Veer, he's one of Frey's servants, and he's known as it's kind of an interesting name. It's barley processing. So you get bread and beer from that. So, food staples. And then his wife and another servant of Frey, Bela, they're not exactly sure what her name means, but it could mean something like cow, bean, or bee, as in the insect bee. So the thing that is sort of similar amongst all those, even though there's a lot of difference between cows and beans and bees, they're all things that can be cultivated and or produce something for humans that they would eat or consume. So, honey from bees and pollination, which is like, I don't know if they would have known about that back then, but like bees as pollinators are huge, and basically agriculture itself depends on that, because we could never fertilize various crops ourselves the way that bees do. So, for example, like corn, there's female corn and male corn, and so you can't just grow one row of corn. It's a funny story. My parents actually grew one row of corn in our garden, and we were living in a more rural area, and farmers would drive by, slow down, laugh, and then drive away, because you need both rows to fertilize each other, and one of the big ways is through insects and bees, and so there's lots of plants that require that. So it's a very agricultural name, which goes very well with Frey, who's, the god of prosperity and like fertility. And, you'd make an offering to Frey at the beginning of the season as you planted, and then like thanks at the harvest. So I can see why he's got these particular servants. And then they mention elves and gods in the at the banquet, and I take that to mean like gods, and then elves. I'm definitely coming around to seeing them as sort of like honored ancestors who aren't quite gods, but they definitely hold a place of esteem in the family. So I guess we've really got the stage set, and so should we continue on?
Let's do it.
So this is verses 3 to 5. Back to the poem. Loki said, I will go into Aegir's hall and see this feast. I will bring them slanders and rumors, and mix their mead with misery. Elder said, you know that if you go into Aegir's hall to visit this feast, bringing slanders and rumors to spill out on their floor, they will wipe those words right off on you. And Loki said, you know, Elder, if you and I were to compete at exchanging insults, it would be lucky for me if you said too much.
So here we go. We've got Loki's intentions. And I think you're right in that we don't know what motivated him to become so bitter and want to sow the seeds of chaos intentionally in a place of peace and prosperity and hospitality, but he wants to do it. And I think that the best that I've been able to come up with on this one is that he is resentful that the gods are having a good time and being successful and prosperous together and celebrating each other and celebrating each other's compliments. And I think the implication is that Loki does not have nearly the same level of accomplishment or the same level of skill, love, whatever you want to put to it, that he is not able to say, okay, here's what I've done to contribute. He does not have something like that to bring to the table, because I think if he did, he wouldn't have been kicked out. He wouldn't have been resentful at a servant being praised. And the servant being praised is also interesting in that it says the gods still recognize the contributions of, well, everyone, essentially. They still recognize the contributions of the people who are there helping them out, the people who are there in the supporting role. And of course, culturally, the servants would have been subordinate, of course, but also probably they would have been actual like slaves, probably. Servant, I think, is a nice word for that anyway, culturally. But that's not to say that they would have had bad lives. They would have just, been subordinate to their masters, and their life is to serve, something like that. But if they do it well, then they get praised and recognized for it. And I think Loki did not have anything worth recognizing, because in the stories that we see him, and we'll see others coming up here, like the Lay of Thrum is a good one, where we see Loki basically create a problem and then solve it, essentially. Well, he doesn't do too much for the creation of that problem, actually, but he does some problem solving and things like that. But a lot of cases he's putting out fires that he's created. And so, I mean, the whole thing with that is that even if he did save the day at the end, the day wouldn't have needed saving without his participation originally, which is a very it's interesting to point to his symbolism. And I think I'll say explicitly here that Loki is definitely aligned with the symbolic chaos that we talk so much about, in the sense that he is not one of the gods that is trying to create this ordered, productive society. He is going against that in a destructive and creative manner. He does things to shake up the status quo, and then he comes around and fixes it through some innovation, which shows the power of innovation, but it also shows the destructive capability of going against social order. It's complex. He's got a great role, but here he is wanting to specifically sow chaos for the sake of sowing chaos. He wants to sow bitterness and malice and throw insults around. I like this, mix their mead with misery. That's a great line, right?
That is a great line.
So this entire thing is just showing Loki's intentions, and I think it points to some intangibles for why he would want to do that. Some things that aren't exactly explained here, but my best understanding of that is that he is bitter and resentful in comparison to the gods, in comparison to those who are doing something productive.
For sure. I wonder if it's that. I don't know. It'd probably be better in the prose edit, but I'd want to check to see if he gets thanked for getting them out of the problems that sometimes he creates. Like maybe he's not getting recognition for becoming, the mare that gives birth to Sleipnir, so that the giant can't create the walls around Asgard in in time kind of thing. Because I get a very Cain feeling from this, and that he's resentful and bitter about something, and that and because of that he's going to try and wreck everything. Nowhere does it say explicitly that it's because he wasn't recognized for some of his contributions. And you're right, oftentimes he was helping to solve a problem that he created. So it might just be that he felt like it wasn't fair. Whereas like the gods were like, well, you started this, like, yeah, you better help like fix it because it's kind of your problem. So yeah, it's one of those things that we can speculate and I think take educated guesses, but ultimately there isn't anything that explicitly says why he's doing what he's doing, which at least from like a modern story standpoint can be a little frustrating, but I think once you accept it and move on, you can really accept that, Loki's about to do some bad stuff. Something that I thought was interesting was I liked the veiled threat that Loki had at the very end of these stanzas that I read, where he says, it would be to Elder that it would be lucky for me if he said too much. And it's like, if the servant went too far in his insult, Loki would probably then actually be justified in killing him, because you shouldn't, insult your masters. And you said something interesting about sort of the life of slaves and servants, because like by and large, the life of a slave and a servant is terrible and rough. There is a however, though, because if you're a slave or a servant to like an aristocrat, your life actually is probably a higher quality than if you were not a slave, but like a peasant. I know like in ancient Rome, like the servants to the politicians enjoyed a lavish life compared to like the normal citizens. Like it wasn't even close. So imagine being a servant to a god. Like it's probably not that bad, especially the way they describe it here. It'd be like the close personal servants to Aegir and Frey. So there's no way that they're going to like let them sort of suffer in squalor around them, because just for appearance's sake, they're going to want their servants to look good serving them in front of everyone. Like it. So there is it's one of those weird things where like, 99% have it terrible, but then you have that like 1% that got lucky and, they're serving the king. So it's, they've got a roof over their head and they've got like pretty decent food because, they're not going to be, they're just not going to have bad food at the at the castle or whatever. And so, yeah, so we, Loki is pretty clearly stating what he's going to do, and I think he's about to do it. So shall we move on?
Let's do it.
So this will be stanzas 6 to 8. Back to the poem. Then Loki went into the hall, and when the feasters saw who had come in, they went silent. Loki said, I come thirsty into this hall, I, Loki, after a long road, to ask the gods to offer me just one drink of their famous mead. Why are you so silent, you proud gods? Why do you say nothing? You ought to show me to my seat at such a feast, or else order me to leave. Bragi said, The gods will never show you to a seat at this feast. The gods know what company they want to share a happy evening's drinking with.
Yeah, so okay, Loki's getting things started, and setting the picture here. Like, this is, he goes in and everyone goes silent, right? Like, you can just see this in a movie or something like that. Like, a big infamous character goes in and suddenly everyone looks over, everyone looks at him and goes silent, and we know something's going to happen now. And then Loki gets right into it. He starts by, I think, directly lying. First of all, he says he's had a long road, right? Which, first of all, I think is just to puff up his need for hospitality, which, of course, we've spoken about quite a lot, especially in the Havamal. But it's a big deal. It's a big deal for a guest to be offered hospitality. But Loki was just here. Loki was just here and he killed someone, right? So he did not have a long road. He's playing it up here, definitely. And he's asking for the hospitality of the gods, but he had already broken the hospitality of the gods. So he's almost insulting some of the deepest traditions that they hold dear here. He's insulting them by asking for hospitality again, but in just a disdainful way, in a completely disingenuous way. So he's not doing this. He's not doing this genuinely. He's not asking for real hospitality. If he had been on one of his adventures with Thor and they'd had a long road and everything like that, I don't think there would have even been a question. It would have been like, hey, Loki, like, come tell us about your fun adventures, sort of thing. But in this case, there's good reason for them to not be so fond of his presence. And then Bragi, who we haven't really met before, but I suppose deserves an introduction here. Bragi is his name is kind of related to poetry, and he is a god of skaldic poetry specifically, and he plays a big role in the part of the Prose Edda that talks about kennings and things like that. But he doesn't really feature too much in the Poetic Edda, except here quite a bit. He's in here. So Bragi is kind of this big poetic guy and all that. And it's interesting that he's the one that kind of pipes up here, but maybe it's because he's the one who's maybe the most eloquent of the gods, and he can quickly snap off a little bit of a, I don't know, it's not necessarily an insult here. He's kind of just stating a fact. Like, they don't want Loki around because they're having a happy evening's drinking, as he puts it here. But they, now they have to deal with Loki showing up and throwing his weight around and kind of playing fast and loose with the rules, and maybe even kind of insulting them. And yeah, it's just not looking like a good situation.
No, definitely. Loki is definitely using the rules of hospitality to kind of beat them over the head. It's funny because it's one of those like really annoying things when, let's say you have certain standards that you try to live up to, and then someone uses them against you to get one over on you. And they, like, the person has no standards or whatever. They're just using it to needle you and basically win over you. So I think too, like, some of the things that Loki does, I know for myself that, like, some of the most annoying things that, if they happen, like, things like betrayal, which there will be. And well, I mean, this whole thing is basically a tale of, to me, a tale of betrayal where Loki kind of goes off on them, and they took him in and trusted him, and he's going off. But it's one of those things where it's not just like, oh, bad guy does this. It's like he's doing like nasty things that really like you get righteously angry against, and we see that here. And I think it's just exactly right, especially with human nature. Just the things he's doing are really, oh, you just want to hit him. And he talks about that a lot. One of the things that we should mention, because none of the gods actually hit him, is that because Aegir is the host, it's sort of his responsibility to either welcome him in or cast him out. The other guests can't do that. They don't. Again, it would be against hospitality for them to sort of to break the wishes of the host. So as long as Aegir is sort of okay with it, Loki is sort of customarily safe because he's under the protection of the host. And I think I recall actually at the end of the story where Thor and Tyr go get the cauldron, Aegir saying that he was kind of going to begrudgingly make beer for them and throw a feast. And I wonder if this is sort of Aegir being like, okay, like I'm throwing the feast, but I'm not going to step in at all. Like I'm doing this because, I'm scared of Thor. But yeah, so it's, I'm already like when I was reading this, I was getting angry at Logan, like, oh, this bastard, like he's just being just a jerk. And I like that Bragi is the first one to speak up, because I think that's right, is that when you're confronted with chaos like this, you ultimately, you try and use words first and think and talk your way out of it before you raise your fists and start fighting, because usually you don't have to, especially in in a forum society, you don't have to go to that length. Usually you want to keep it in the realm of speaking, because then it's safe for everyone. And so having Bragi be the first one to talk, I think makes a lot of sense, because you're starting at the least amount of resistance possible to get the desired outcome of Loki shutting up. And then you can increase from there. But if you were to start at just, killing him, well, there's problems with that too, right?
Yeah, the gods, none of them want to break hospitality themselves. They don't want to do that, because if they were to do that, they would be just as guilty of breaking the rules as Loki was, and they actually care about the rules and would presumably be held accountable for them. And Loki, it's interesting. I mean, he was sort of held accountable by being kicked out, right? But then what do you do if someone doesn't play by the rules of the punishment, something like that? Like he's really being some combination of like the recalcitrant child and absolutely like he's one of those people, as you're saying, who just breaks the rules in all the right or wrong ways, depending on how you see it. Like he skirts the law and maybe holds to the letter of it when it suits him, but just really, really breaking the spirit of it. And no, this entire thing, it's the gods don't want to resort to violence, and I think Loki is trying to provoke them into violence, something like that. Maybe even something like, "Hey, see, you're not any better than me," sort of thing, right? Like I think this entire thing is something like that. Loki is trying to prove and provoke the gods into acting the way he acts, and then they have no justification to punish him or to insult him or to kick him out. They wouldn't be any better than him in that case. And again, I'm taking a small leap in logic here by going in that direction, but I think it makes sense with his character and with how he's behaving.
I would agree. I think there's definitely a sense of Loki of him wanting to drag everyone down to his level and sort of show that none of the gods are nearly as good and as virtuous as they seem to think, and they're a lot more like him than they would want to believe. The other thing, though, that we have to keep in mind is that Loki lies a lot. So as we see, a lot of the things he's going to say, we we can kind of tell that he's actually lying. But there is still that doubt, and that's the beauty of a rumor, right? Is like it might, even if you know that it's not true, because it's out there, it takes on a life of its own, and kind of like it can start wearing away at like, well, when if there's a rumor about a certain action, it's like, well, no, I saw this, that's not how it went. But then you can start making, well, I only saw it that one time. What if he did it again? And so you start questioning, and that's Loki all over the place, right? Like that's what he does. Shall we move on to his response?
Let's do it.
Stanza number 9, back to the poem. Do you remember, Odin, when in bygone days we blended our blood? You told me then that you would never taste a drink that was not served to us both.
So, okay, Loki kind of, he opens with his biggest gotcha, which to me for timing maybe is a little bit strange, but I suppose this is the way he gets to potentially take a seat at the table here. He appeals to Odin to some agreement that they have made between each other, that they would never taste a drink that was not served to them both. And what he says by blending their blood, that's some sort of blood brothership, which would be, maybe if you've seen kind of in movies or something like that, like the two heroes maybe make a cut on their hand or something like that, and then shake hands or some other variation on that. And there is significant power in blood, and there was belief that blood held like quite a bit of unique and special power. It's life force. There's countless myths about blood that go back centuries and millennia, and so what they're doing here is something powerful and magical. And this is the only place where this is referenced. So again, with the lying and all that, but we'll see with Odin's response that there might be some truth to it. That said, so what's happening here is, I think the role of Odin is more interesting than the role of Loki here. If they were to have made some sort of agreement, some sort of blood brothership, and agreed that Odin would never taste a drink that was not served to them both. The wording here is important because I don't think it says necessarily that Odin is not allowed to drink anything without Loki being there physically, sort of thing, but the drink has to be offered to them both. And we've touched on offerings a little bit as well, in the sense that the gods know that they are worth being offered things. And a potential reason for the original Aesir-Vanir war was that the Vanir, which is Freyr and Freya and Njord and a bunch of the other more agriculturally oriented gods, they found themselves in a position where they believed they were also worthy of receiving these offerings, and maybe the Aesir didn't quite agree with that, and they wanted some supremacy and all that there. And then Aesir-Vanir war, which we talk about in the Voluspa. But the whole thing with these offerings is that an offering made to Loki is an offering of chaos. It's an offering of, I think symbolically, if you were to put forward an offering to Loki, and we've talked about prayer as well. I think prayer and offerings are in a similar boat as far as what they're actually doing, which is focusing yourself on something, some goal. And I think focusing on Loki and inviting Loki in and making an offering to Loki, all of these are variations on inviting chaos into your life. And we see certainly that Loki has the potential to do good things with that. He's disruptive of order in general, which is hard to deal with, especially for those of us who are really trying to order their lives, things like that, that can be tough, but it can also be very good. It can shake things up. It can be creative. It can bring opportunities that weren't quite available without that shakeup. And to do that, if you make an offering to Loki, that'd be a pretty good way to do it. But for Odin to say this as well, it's interesting. This is Loki. Sorry, this is Odin specifically saying that he is going to accept offerings of chaos. He's going to merge with the chaos. He's going to live with it. He's going to embrace it, and through that, hopefully, he's going to be able to create something new and succeed in his goal of surviving Ragnarok, whether it's himself or future generations, right? So it ties into a bigger picture here. What I maybe have a slight issue with is that he would never taste a drink that was not served to them both. So he's almost saying, I won't take offerings that are not oriented towards the type of chaos that Loki represents. That's a little tricky for me, because I think Odin would also be totally fine without this stanza saying so, would be totally fine with offerings of any kind, because first of all, he's the top guy, top of the dominance hierarchy there, but he also turns to drink specifically as a sort of byline for inspiration in general, and Odin is all about inspiration. That's what his name means. And by interacting so much with drinks that are offered in a spirit of chaos, maybe that is his way of interacting and living on that edge, which allows him to create, as opposed to, well, he creates from chaos in order to build his greater order, his greater society, everything like that. So
exactly, like Odin being at the top of the dominance hierarchy, he's basically made a friend of chaos, in that he can have one foot in chaos and one foot in order, just as he's got sort of one eye in chaos and one eye in order. That's why he's able to get that inspiration. And I hadn't thought of the link between Odin drinking mead and never tasting a drink that would not be served to both of them. And I think that really points out symbolically that you do need chaos in your life so that you can grow and create, and you have something to order, really. And then also the danger of not having chaos, and that it stagnates and dies. And so Odin not wanting to stagnate and die is saying, no, like I will never be in a situation where I will not allow chaos in. I will not ever be that ordered that we don't allow it in, it's sort of the right way to be. And I would hesitate to suggest anyone, necessarily make like a blood brother of chaos, because I think there is a line between inviting chaos and being okay with chaos, and again, as it's put in the Bible with Cain, like basically inviting demons and rutting with them like pigs. I can't remember exactly how it's put, but there is a difference between inviting chaos or inspiration into your life versus like allowing chaos to overtake your life and having no order whatsoever. And I think that's the line that they kind of allude to here, and that Odin tries to walk, is that he's getting the best of both worlds so that he can create something new. And I would love if one day they found like a manuscript that had that particular story where they became blood brothers. I'm sure it'd be interesting.
It would be interesting. And if I take a step back here and think about kind of what this would mean if I were attempting, and not that I would put myself on a level with Odin, that's just a life goal to strive to be a fraction as awesome as Odin, and only the good parts too, not the weird bad behavior that Odin gets up to.
Yeah.
we talk about that in the Havamal a fair bit. But anyway, not to put myself on a level with Odin, but also to put myself into the situation. I think it's kind of like he is open to whatever life can throw at him. He's saying like, bring it on, and he'll handle it. He'll deal with it, because that's what the hero does, is deal with these unknowns and this chaos. And so it's right for Odin to be in that situation, but now Loki's abusing it. And again, we do have to remember that Loki is possibly lying, possibly being deceitful. I don't know for sure what is and is not, because we don't have any other confirmation elsewhere. But Odin's reaction to Loki saying all this might be a bit telling. And so
let's see what Odin says. Verses or stanzas 10 to 11. Back to the poem. Odin said, "Get up, Vithar. Let this father of wolves take a seat and have a drink. Let's not let Loki slander us here in Aegir's hall." Then Vithar stood up and served Loki a drink. Before he drank, Loki said, "Hail, gods and goddesses, all the high and holy Aesir, except for that one god who sits furthest down the bench. That one there, Bragi."
Okay, so I'll address these in two parts here. First, Odin either lightly confirms that what Loki is saying is true, at least to some extent, by not immediately smacking down what Loki's just said. He says to his son Vidar to get up and give him a seat. So here's Odin, the top god, basically appeasing Loki, attempting to appease Loki and ideally avoid violence, something like that. And so whether or not he's just saying to Vidar to get up just for the sake of appeasement, or whether it's like, yeah, you got me there, okay, come have a seat, stop slandering us, something like that. The combination, though, is, I think, at least light confirmation of the previous stanza to say that Loki and Odin have some kind of a special relationship. And then we get into Vidar a little bit. And Vidar is interesting. We've talked about him again a few places, but he is the one who is eventually going to succeed Odin after Ragnarok and be the wide ruler. And I think here, Vidar is still in his silent phase, right, which is basically until Odin dies. But he's still subordinate and he's still learning to rule. And he gets to be in the role of a servant here towards Loki. He's learning that humility. He's learning that to be a ruler is not necessarily to be the most proud person in the room all the time, sort of thing. He's learning these skills, and he's not above Loki, even though he's the son of Odin and eventually going to be his heir. So I think that's interesting on the part of Vidar here, and he complies. He's serving Loki a drink, but Loki's having none of it. Loki's not appeased. We know how appeasement goes historically, I think, and it's the same here. He just takes the little bit that's offered him and just runs with it. Goes and insults Bragi, and maybe it's because Bragi was the first one to step up and say, hey, the gods will never show you to a seat at this feast. And then, well, here, look, I've got a seat at the feast now, and I'm gonna hail all the gods except you now, Bragi. And it's like, oh, come on, like he just gets right into it. But anyway, this is really the meat of the poem getting started, and a little interesting semi-confirmation from Odin that he's got a special relationship with Loki.
Absolutely. And I think, too, it's interesting that Odin gets his own son, and one of his beloved sons. He, like, not to, you never want to like rank a parent's love for their children, but I'm going to rank the children because it's pretty clear in the poems that the favored son of everyone is Balder, and that will get mentioned a little later. Vidar, however, does hold a very special place in Odin's heart, and he often would go to Vidar, who is silent, and tell him a lot of his secrets that he wouldn't tell anyone else, because he is silent and he knew he wouldn't spread them, but also because that Vidar is going to be killing Fenrir and surviving Ragnarok and bringing the knowledge of the gods into the new world. So he's got this incredible duty that he has to fulfill. And so having him be the one to stand up and let Loki sit there like that, he's giving Loki a place of prominence. And I think that's why he also mentions that, Bragi's sitting down the bench. Like, he's not as close to the head of the table as one might want to be. It's also interesting, I think, that Vidar is the one that gets up because he ultimately is the one who kills Fenrir, who is Loki's son. So it's interesting dynamics going on. It's probably also worth mentioning that just going off of what you said about humility and Vidar learning to be a leader and a servant, is that Vidar is considered the second strongest only to Thor. So we know Vidar could take care of himself. Well, he kills Fenrir. That's no small feat. He could certainly physically kill Loki. There's no threat of Loki to Vidar. It's just not happening. So I do think there's sort of that confidence that lets him serve Loki without being like, oh, fine, like begrudgingly doing it. It's just like, okay, like this isn't a big deal to me. Shall we move on?
Yeah, let's dive into the real meat of this poem.
See how Bragi reacts to that nice jab. These are stanzas 12 to 15. Back to the poem. Bragi said, I will give you a horse and a sword. I offer you these freely, and a ring, but in exchange, please don't slander the gods. Don't awake their anger. Loki said, since when have you had a treasure or horse to give? Of all the gods and elves inside this hall, you're the biggest coward. Bragi said, if we were outside and you had not come inside Aegir's hall, I would be holding your severed head. I'd pay you back that way for all your lies. Loki said, you're brave while you're sitting, but you wouldn't do that, Bragi, you bench warmer. Go ahead and strike me if you're so angry. A brave man wouldn't be afraid to do it.
What an exchange. Again, Loki is not pulling any punches. So Bragi, his initial response is, again, attempting to cool the situation. Like, here, I'll give you all this stuff to calm down, stop insulting the gods, and importantly, not awake their anger. Bragi knows full well what could happen if the gods are provoked. Bragi is a master of poetry. He's a master of kennings. He's a master of the skaldic arts. Probably one of the most highly regarded people in the society, really, because skaldic poetry was just held in such high regard. It was like the peak of intellectual debate and prowess was to be a good, accomplished skaldic poet, because you had to have mastery over so many things and you had to have broad, wide-ranging knowledge, right? And there's some speculation, I think, that Bragi is the distillation of the ultimate poet, is essentially what he is. And it could have been from maybe a particular hero or something like that, and then he eventually turned into this god, but that's sort of speculation, but that also fits with the idea of how myths are created and how gods are created. It's like the ultimate hero in whatever dimension. And for this one, it would be Bragi would be the ultimate poet. He is the ultimate poet, and so he knows full well what the consequences of provoking the gods are. Tries to calm that down, but yeah, Loki really just isn't going to let that go here. Calls him a coward, right? And maybe there's something to that in the sense that, if you focus too much on one skill, one thing, you're going to be sort of less accomplished in others. That's fairly natural. Like, there are very few people who are good at absolutely everything and are going to be the top of the dominance hierarchy in everything that they try. There's very, very, very few people like that. Usually it's you specialize and get very, very good at one thing, and that's to the detriment of others. So maybe he's implying that for Bragi, he's very good at his poetry, but maybe he's not so good at fighting, and maybe he's not so willing to attempt to fight. But then of course here, if they were outside, Bragi would take care of him. So this whole thing is poking at something very particular here, I think, which is perhaps the ability for Bragi to fulfill the role expected of a leading man in society here in this culture, which is to be able to physically defend himself and physically, pay Loki back for his insults and all that. But the fallback here is that they are still inside Aegir's Hall, and they are under the auspices of hospitality, which would prevent any good, well-behaving person in the society from attacking Loki. And that's sort of the point.
Oh, definitely. Like, that's Loki, and Loki knows that, so he's gonna push it to the limit. And there's not much, and actually we'll see what happens coming up. But one other thing to mention about Bragi is that we actually get our term bragging from his name. So it's something that has sort of continued on into the modern world. And it's funny, like you're saying, like Bragi would absolutely know what happens when the gods become angry, because he's probably written poems about it and can describe it in 50 other ways other than the gods got angry. It could be like, the gods prepared a feast for the ravens or something like that. And again, I think it shows too how society often deals with conflict and issues. At least a well-functioning society is that it's a lot of talking, at least at first. And you try and solve the problem with ideas and in a peaceful manner. And he's trying to offer peace. He's trying to offer basically a bribe to appease Loki and say, hey, have some of this stuff and, we'll all get on, and, everything's forgiven. Don't worry about it. And you can see that happen. I mean, the first thing that happens with any problem in society is that people talk about it. And in your own life, that people talk about it. That's one of the reasons why, like, free speech is so important, is that so you can talk about problems and not resort to violence right off the bat. Like, you want the ideas to fight. You don't want the people to fight, because ideas can die and everyone's okay. Like, you're not, your house doesn't get burned down. People don't die. It's a pretty good system. And so we see that here. And, it'll be interesting to see if talking actually solves the problem, or if we'll have to, some people would say, I guess, devolve into violence. But actually, that'll be interesting for when that comes up. Shall we go on?
Let's do it.
Stanzas 16 to 18. And it starts with Ithun, Bragi's wife, speaking. Back to the poem. Ithun said, I beg you, Bragi, think of your children by blood and by adoption, and don't slander even Loki here in Aegir's Hall. Loki said, Silence, Ithun. I don't think there's any woman more lustful than you, not since you wrapped your pretty arms around the killer of your brother. Ithun said, I will not slander even Loki here in Aegir's Hall. I will calm you, beer-maddened Bragi. I don't want you two to fight.
Okay, so Bragi's wife Ithun is into the picture here now, and again, trying to calm things down. And she's making an appeal to the importance of Bragi staying alive. She sees that this could, they just saw Loki kill the servant, right? So she doesn't want this to happen to her husband. She doesn't want it to happen to the father of their children by blood and by adoption, which implies that they are quite a good, generous couple that is spreading their resources to the next generation very widely. Idun is the keeper of the apples, which give the gods eternal life, and so she's very important. If she were not in the picture, the apples were not available, bad things would happen, and that's another story. But they are together. Idun and Bragi are, I think, well regarded, highly regarded, and Idun does not want Bragi to get into it. She even calls him beer maddened, which I think we've also seen, and there's some wisdom in the Havamal about not drinking too much. That's an understatement, but so here, Loki is now turning his sights to the next god, and that's going to be a pattern that someone's going to try and prevent Loki, get him to calm down, and then he turns his sights on them, and then. So here, this is the difference between Loki insulting the man Bragi and the woman Idun, is that Bragi is insulted for, maybe his martial abilities, or he's called a coward, whereas Idun is called lustful. And that is certainly a remnant of what we talk about a lot in our previous episode, our previous Kalevala episode, The Fate of Aino, where we talk a lot about the implications of monogamy on society and how that would have resulted in different patterns of behavior being emphasized for men and for women. And here, calling a woman lustful or some variation on that would certainly be implying that Idun is going against the social norms of, at least once in marriage, of staying faithful to her husband. And it's quite a thing. The killer of her brother, and unfortunately, it's unknown who that is. This is the only place where this is brought up, where this is mentioned, where the story of Idun being with the killer of her brother is mentioned. So this could be a straight up fabrication from Loki, or it could be a lost story that we know nothing about. And maybe that adds to the allure of this poem, where he could be lying, but he could also be referring to some truths, right? Which is interesting. Some truths we don't have. And so it's left up to the imagination, which is right in this case. But at the end of the day, Idun is attempting to keep the peace, which is the role that a lot of women fulfill in these stories. And one of the examples we've talked about was in Skirnismal, where Gerda she agrees to keep the peace and everything like that. That's an oversimplification, but we talk more about that in that episode. But this is another example here where Idun is attempting to calm down the potential for violence and does not want to see anyone die. And maybe that points to her motivations as well. She doesn't want to see her husband, her provider, die. Even though she has a great role in society, that would probably be quite detrimental to her own personal well-being if her husband died. And so she doesn't want to see that. She doesn't want to see violence, and that's the reason why.
For sure. And just going back to the charge about her being a lustful woman, that's a very serious charge at the time. I guess fidelity within marriage was sort of paramount for a few reasons. One, they wanted every child to have a mother and a father, and like a lot of it was for legality's sake, but also you need both of them to take care of the child. You don't want the father skipping town, and that's actually one of the reasons why one of the modern customs or traditions in the West is for the woman to take the man's last name. It was so that they could easily identify the children, and he wouldn't just be able to leave after getting his wife pregnant and having the baby, because why would you stay when she's completely occupied with this screaming hungry, like annoying little human that doesn't really do anything. It doesn't, it like, it, the question isn't why do people stay with their babies? It's why don't they just leave them like in the woods kind of thing? Well, they did. And one of the ways to get around that was to give them all the same names so that you knew who to sort of make sure stuck around. Like, so, because I know today too, a lot of people think like, oh, it's, it's about the husband owning the wife. And it's actually, no, it's about the wife owning the husband. So she has some recourse when he decides like, yeah, I'm out of here. But we see that too. And we see something very common where, the wife, or, if you're of the age where you go to bars or clubs on the weekend, if there's going to be a fight between two guys, it's often the women sort of like holding them back and saying, no, it's not worth it. Don't worry about it. And in that way, they kind of play a check on testosterone. And actually, like, I mean, studies have shown when men get married, their testosterone drops quite a bit. Part of it is because they now have a mate. They don't have to try and entice someone to procreate with them. But also, like, men are generally happy and they have something that's worthwhile and they don't want to do something stupid and lose it. And Ithun is kind of reminding Bragi right here, like, you've got things to live for and people who are depending on you. Like, let it go. Like, this isn't worth it. Let it go. And then Loki slanders Ithun with, well, you're lustful. And it's the common insult to women, but it's also attacking the very things that Ithun is talking to Bragi about being worthwhile, right? Like children, like, well, crap, if the kids aren't Bragi's, then what does he have to lose, really? And it's also interesting that, again, I'd love to see that story with Ithun and her brother and the killer of her brother. Again, we don't have any indication that, well, it doesn't survive. Like, we haven't found it yet, but it'd be interesting to see what that is all about. And also, I think it's important to mention too, the insults that Loki is throwing around. Like, if this was in a public area, and it would be well within the rights of Bragi to attack and kill Loki, or they would just outlaw him and kick him out of the village. Like, these are very serious charges that he's just like throwing around. Again, I've mentioned this many times, but Germania by Tacitus talks a lot about the social mores of the Germanic peoples, and like Loki is really going against all of them, and would be outside of the protection of the host, would be dealt with swiftly.
Definitely, and the whole thing here is that these accusations, I think it is implied that they're baseless. But again, we can't be certain, right? If they do have some merit, he's airing the gods' dirty laundry, which is really another violation of the norm, I suppose, because maybe Ithun and Bragi have dealt with the fact that there was some infidelity sort of thing, and he doesn't mind. They've got adopted children as well. He's dependable and will stick around, sort of thing. And but. You don't tell the entire society about those sorts of struggles necessarily, especially if it's going to dishonor Ithun to a great extent. Because first of all, that would be dishonorable to her. That would put her in a lower status socially, and then that would impact Bragi as well. Like, he would look like the guy who is whose wife is sleeping around, essentially. And but then even further, it would be like, if she is dishonored, then that would also hurt him. Like, and it would hurt him in the sense that not just the social aspect, but I'm sure he would hate to see his wife shamed like that. If these things are true, and Loki is bringing up things that are actually happened, right? But again, it's that ambiguity, and it's interesting. But yeah, the root of this. He's getting to some fundamental things, and maybe that's why they're so hurtful.
Absolutely. And just going by Odin's reaction at the beginning, I would guess that he was telling the truth about the being blood brothers with Odin. So he's told one truth at least. So then it's you have to start like taking these other things like, well, he was right about that. Like, I don't know. And because we don't have, in some ways we're lucky because we don't have it. I think it actually adds to the drama of the story and the symbolic nature. Like we really have to like sit and think about it and consider both sides. Like, well, what if it is true? With that, shall I move on? Stanzas 19 and 20. Gefjun said, "Why should two gods exchange insulting words inside this hall? I think Loki is a cheerful fellow. Everybody loves him." Loki said, "Silence, Gefjun. I remember that boy who seduced you into his bed. That handsome boy gave you a necklace, and you opened your thighs for him."
So Gefjun here tries to take Loki's side. Maybe a different tactic is going to work here. Maybe butter him up a little bit, give him some compliments. And, it's probably not far from the truth in that he's probably a cheerful fellow generally. Everyone loves him. Like the trickster or the trickster type character is usually pretty. He's also the comic relief, as you said, right? So he's probably a good guy to hang out with. That's probably why Thor is kind of okay with him coming along in all their adventures, right? He might be a devious little guy, but he's also fun to be around and adds something intangible to the trip, right? But Gefjun here tries to bring that in, and nope, Loki basically calls her a slut again, and so he's definitely not making any friends here. Gefjun is a goddess of agriculture, fertility, one of the type of gods that really is from that older agricultural phase of life where everything would have been cyclical and based on the success of agriculture, and so we get lots of deities that are based on that. And so Gefjun would have been one of those type of gods, which is interesting here in that, if Loki's going to pick one goddess here, or one type of goddess anyway, to sort of say, hey, so this boy here, he gave you a necklace and then you opened your thighs for him, it might actually not be so far from the symbolic truth of that, because agriculture was seen as a metaphor for the primeval fertilization. The ground was the mother who was fertilized by the rain, by the sky god. And so this Mother Earth would have accepted the seed and accepted the fertilization and the literal showering of wealth that the rain would have represented, and in return she gives the crops, the agriculture. And so it's a symbolic exchange that would have been really, really meaningful at the time, where it would have been, yes, we have to pay our respects to Mother Earth and to various Mother Earth type goddesses, because they are the ones who are really doing the fertility. And it gets into the mysteries of childbirth, which men will never be able to understand. And like I understand that now on a symbolic level, even more so than just I can't relate to that kind of level. But on a symbolic level, that's the biggest mystery of life. It's the mystery that underpins why we're here and how we're able to exist and how we're able to continue to prosper. It's a big deal. And Loki's kind of sullying that. He's first of all, he's implying that it's a negative, that this would be the role that Gefjun necessarily would have been in, by almost taking something that would have been sacred in her role and profaning it by making it so mundane. It's like a boy gave you a necklace and you opened your thighs. But on another level, I think it's kind of like, the boy is proving his worth and his ability to. Well, I mean, I think that's what jewelry broadly is. It's like the boy or man has enough resources that he can spend some of those resources on this pretty thing that looks nice, but doesn't do much, and you can have it to wear it, to show your status and to show the affections of said man. And it's meant as proof of ability to take care of her. And that's what the man, or the men in general, are attempting to do. They're attempting to compete for the affections of said woman. And so he's doing it right. And Gefjun, in her judgment, because she is the one doing the judging, all the women are the ones doing the judging. That's why many men feel quite so inadequate all the time when they're kind of in puberty or even onwards, where it's like, oh man, like I'll never measure up to the standards of these women. And that's right. Actually, I think it's, you set the bar high, you know, but she is discerning. And if this is true, right? If this is true on a specific level, you know, she's discerning and believes the boy has earned the right to be with her. And that's the exchange that has been taking place for thousands of years. But on a symbolic level, that's very, very true and right and accurate. But on a specific level, you know, maybe now it turns into, hey, we're not encouraging that anymore. And certainly this implies that their society at this point has become a monogamous society that is enforced by encouraging certain behaviors and discouraging others. And of course, we've mentioned, especially in Call of Alaruno 4 there, we've especially mentioned that can come off very negatively for the women there. But as you were saying, with the men not being allowed to run away sort of thing, it's also it ties both parties down to each other, and it's good for both parties and bad for both parties depending on how you look at it. But the whole thing here is that Loki is poking at this very specific thing which would have underpinned society for a very long time and been a positive thing and being a part of human nature. And he's profaning it and making it mundane.
Definitely. And when you're talking about the sort of the importance and the role of fertility goddesses and sky gods, it made me think of a term I just learned from reading Joseph Campbell, but it's also in Mircea Eliade as well. It's called hierogamy, or hierogamy as it gets anglicized, which is basically divine marriage and divine sex kind of thing, where you have the sky god fertilizing the Mother Earth so that things can grow. We'll see a little bit about it later on when Loki starts talking to Frey and Freya. And speaking of Freya, there's speculation that Gefjun might actually be Freya, even though they talk to Freya and use her name Freya later on in this poem. But there's a lot of I guess Gefjun fulfills a lot of the similar roles that Freya would in terms of harvest and fertility and that kind of thing. Her and Frey, that's sort of their shared realm, and sexuality as well. Gefjun is one of the many names that Freya has, or it's at least a cognate of one of the many names that Freya has. Just like Odin has a whole bunch of other names. And there is actually a story of Freya getting a necklace from a dwarf by sleeping with him. The necklace is called Brissinger, and it means something like fire, or it's this beautiful necklace that looks like it's on fire kind of thing. And in order to get it, she sleeps with the dwarf. So there's kind of a story that fits with this charge that Loki is laying yesterday. It doesn't fit perfectly because the names might not match, but again, it's enough to wonder, like, Jesus, is Loki telling the truth here that, Gefjun, slept with this boy just to get a necklace that was pretty? Like, I don't know. It's that seed of doubt that's like it's perfect. It's even more perfect and easier to carry off or pull off because we don't know the stories, but we have these these glimpses here and there of things that kind of fit. So yeah, it's definitely adding to my, like, I don't know if enjoyment is the right word, but like it's definitely more intriguing and like, well, geez, is Loki telling the truth here? And it's just that uncomfortable, terrible truth that you don't want to have to face. And with that, shall we move on?
Let's do it.
This is stanzas 21 to 24. Odin said, "You're mad, Loki, out of your wits. If you want to make Gefjun angry, I think she foresees the fates of all living things as well as I do." Loki said, "Silence, Odin. You always judge battles unfairly for humans. You have often given defeat to the better side when you shouldn't have." Odin said, "You know, even if I did judge unfairly and made the better side lose, I know that you, for 8 years, lived on the earth down below as a cow in milk and as a woman, and you've given birth to children. I call that a pervert's way of living." Loki said, "But people say that you practiced womanly magic on Samsi, dressed as a woman. You lived as a witch among the humans, and I call that a pervert's way of living."
Okay, so I'm going to avoid the pervert's way of living for a bit.
Why would you do that?
Oh, I don't know. That's going to be a fun one. So, at the beginning here, Odin steps in. Now we're getting serious. And maybe he actually adds some credence to the idea that Gefjun might be related to Freya, because he's implying something that Freya is also known for being a Scythe woman, essentially, and understanding magic and seeing the future and all that. So, maybe there's something to that. But the first part here that I want to dig into a little bit is that Odin might be somewhat arbitrary in his decision of battle. And that's something that we know is Odin's role. He decides battles. And if we're going to attribute something to a god, right, the ability to decide battles is pretty important. Back in the day, it would have been significant. And maybe there's some element of taking the responsibility for the battle away from the people actually doing the battling, probably because there would have been such an element of randomness to it that it would have been completely unknown a lot of the time who was going to win, because who knows really when you don't have tactical maps or you don't have modern military equipment, things like that. It could have been very random, and there's a lot of great tactical battles of the early modern age, but they certainly wouldn't have been the scale or the sophistication of what we know now and how to minimize risk and things like that. Lots of people would have died in these battles. And so giving Odin the role of choosing the fate of the slain sort of thing, that's significant, because whichever side wins, you could say that Odin decided the battle this way. But if Odin goes against your side, well, that's huge. That means your side has fallen out of favor with Odin. Maybe the best that you could say about it is that Odin decided that a bunch of your men deserved to go to either Valhalla or Freya's Folkvang. Again, bringing the Odin and Freya thing kind of together here. But the biggest thing on that, I think, is that maybe that is a pretty good way of making sense of the world being so random, and especially things like battle being so random, is to say that, well, maybe Odin is arbitrary in that regard, and maybe you would start to maybe resent that a little bit, like if you're on the losing side of battles. And I mean, saying that, if you're judging a defeat to the better side, right? Everyone's going to think that they're the better side. Everyone, right? So if you lose, well, then you say, oh, well, Odin gave victory to the wrong side there. Speaks to maybe the real level and nature of how Odin would have been seen. He's not this perfect god who gets everything right. And even if this is, again, one of Loki's kind of stretching untruths sort of thing, which Odin kind of says, he doesn't really address that. Well, even if I did judge unfairly and make the better side lose, he kind of acknowledges it here. Loki might be getting it right with Odin in particular, which is, that's probably the person to get it right with. You know, if Loki were outright lying about Odin, I think the story would be a lot shorter. But I think he is actually bringing in some significant truths, and maybe painful truths, about Odin here, like perhaps his arbitrariness, or the, you know, from earlier, the idea that they are blood brothers, which would be significant, right? But, well, then we get into a pervert's way of living. So Odin and Loki essentially are both trading what they see as like really, really deep insults, and it essentially involves living as the opposite sex, literally in Loki's case. And we do have cases where Loki has mothered children. Loki has been the mother to Sleipnir, and well, and living as a cow in milk is that's kind of saying, well, he's living as essentially a permanently pregnant or milk bearing cow for 8 years, something like that, right? And I think saying it's a pervert's way of living is implying that Loki is perhaps getting something out of that maybe he shouldn't enjoy it so much necessarily. But on the face of it, this is really condemning living as the opposite sex. That's certainly what is happening here. They're not beating about the bush. Even if they're insulting each other, they're being very specific that they are condemning that behavior. But that behavior isn't literal here in our sense, because it's not to say that Loki would have, as a person, if he were just a person, that he is literally changing into a cow sort of thing. Loki the god might, but it's not saying that this is something that they were ever capable of for the average person sort of thing. So they're not condemning personal behavior that would have been possible. On a symbolic level, what Loki is doing here, this is him fully immersed in the creative aspect of his role as a chaotic being. He's embracing the ability to be creative as opposed to destructive. And even though he is the father of wolves, right? He's also the mother of Sleipnir. The wolves are very destructive, but Sleipnir is Odin's steed, right? He's a very, very big, important character for the gods. And so Loki going and doing this, he is exploring this side and almost taking a part of the role as the symbolic great mother here, which is one of the most important and complex symbols that we have in mythology. And so what Loki's doing is not wrong. It's not negative. It's perhaps, though, it's strange for a male character to be exploring that. And that's what we're really getting at here. And Loki is throwing it back at Odin as well and saying that Odin is practicing magic that generally would have only been accessible to women. And I say it like that for a reason, because in general, I think there are mysteries of the world that are only accessible to women, childbirth being one of them. And then the magic that comes out of that is something that is inaccessible to most men. But Odin is not most men. And he goes in and immerses himself in it. If he goes and lives as a witch among the humans, well, he's immersing himself in this magic. And it's stated elsewhere that he picks up magic that Freya was a master of before. And this is all Odin integrating everything he possibly can in order to achieve his goals. And that's admirable. Loki can call him a pervert, and Odin can call Loki a pervert, but they're both doing things that are right symbolically. Loki is fully exploring chaos to the fullest extent, which involves the creative aspect that only the Great Mother is capable of. And Odin is doing everything he possibly can to understand the way the world works, which involves spending some time outside of his gender role. It involves him spending some time outside of that and integrating that into himself and his personality. Now, them calling it a pervert, calling each other perverts, a pervert's way of living, well, that's kind of, first of all, they're being insulting towards one another. So, of course, they would kind of have an insulting bent on it. But that also really, really does imply that that is against the norm, though. That is against the social norm. And there are many reasons for that. But it is to say that regardless of what they are doing and whether or not it's a good thing, whether or not they're accomplishing something good, it does go against the social norm.
For sure. And, we definitely aren't interested or in the business of sanitizing history. So we have to take it for what it is. And the view that they would be acting as women was seen as unmanly. And so it was a perversion of the natural order for them. The idea is, well, for one thing, there was great emphasis put on, penetration between the genders. So one of the reasons why the magic that Odin learned from Freya is considered unmanly is that it's sort of this idea, it's seen as trance work. So when you're giving up control and spirits are entering into you. So as a man, you're not supposed to be entered into. And so that's where a lot of that sort of unmanliness comes from. And then Loki, giving birth and all that kind of stuff, that specifically men don't do that. So that's where it's coming from. And as well, you could ask, well, okay, well, why is it a perversion according to them, or why is it a problem? And that comes from the idea that the way that you would create new human life is for the man to penetrate the woman, sort of basic biology. And if you're doing it the other way around, you're not going to create any new life, and without new life, the tribe does not survive. You need to keep producing new tribe members. And we don't see it too much because there's a lot of people on the earth, and we're population and continuing on of the peoples or whatever civilization. It's pretty well assured. Like we don't have that issue now, but like back then they did have that issue. Like the population would have been in the hundreds for a lot of these tribes. So it was very important that everyone not only like replaced themselves, but also added to the population so that, if a famine came through, the population could take the hit, and then they could, sort of replenish it. Like it's really like, it's funny to think about it from the modern times, because one, we don't have a lot of these things that will wipe out, a huge percentage of the population just like that. We don't wake up, or we don't have like a year where a third of the people died. Like it just doesn't happen anymore. So we don't think about the real, like the actual like incidents of needing to replace ourselves. Like it's not at the forefront of our mind. And to get into that mindset where, you have to replace yourself and create it, it's very different. And so you would absolutely discourage practices that would not add to the population. You would want, well, it's not helpful. It's not going to be good for the tribe. It's not going to strengthen it. And that's all you have. That the only thing you have against the chaos and the terror of nature is your tribe. So yeah, they were very conscious of making sure the tribe and the tribal population stayed strong. And I think that is where some of these ideas of perversion come, is that they're perverting the way, like the natural order of the tribe. And again, like we know that because we have these stories that Odin and Loki are saying true things about each other. And so it adds, like, well, is he telling the truth all the time? Is he lying? Like, yeah, it's plus they're digging in deep. Like, these are things that they both kind of had to do in order to fulfill their roles. You know, that, like, we'll see in I think the next poem we do, where, you know, Thor dresses up as a bride, and it's, you know, filled with hilarity, and it isn't a downer story like this one. It's like a fun story, like, oh, haha, Thor is dressing up like a woman. But this is like they're throwing serious charges against each other for things that they had to do.
Yeah, and I think that's a key point here, is that I don't think we're dealing with anything relating to preference, that we're looking at something that Odin had to do in order to, well, we could even take it as far as maybe he wouldn't have even ever been able to retrieve the runes without going and exploring all these magical avenues, and he probably wouldn't have been able to, or maybe he wouldn't have been able to get the foresight so that he could see what would happen going on into the future, right? And Loki as well, like, he's fulfilling his symbolic role. Loki is certainly a complex character that has a lot of potential roles, and he does a lot of different things in different stories. But the one thing that connects him is that he is always in symbolic chaos. He always is. But if we only saw the destructive aspects of that, or we only saw the scrambling to put out a fire, which of course involves ingenuity, which is a form of creativity, which is a form of creation by different layers of extension, we still wouldn't be seeing true creation. And that's what we see through Loki. And in fact, we don't really have a proper great mother figure in Norse mythology that I can really put my finger on and say that's it. And when I say that, I'm not an expert in this symbol, not even close. In fact, out of all the symbols, the Great Mother is one of those that's like, wow, I'm going to have to spend some time and read some books and really learn about this, because that's different and beyond my current level of understanding. That said, my best understanding of it is that it is a feminine symbol that encompasses creation and destruction simultaneously. And it is a feminine symbol because it's related to this symbolic chaos, and it involves creation through childbirth and also destruction through just the worst possible of means. And Kali in Hinduism is one of the most often cited examples of this great mother figure. And Kali has different I wouldn't call them sub goddesses, but like different
Aspects, I guess. Yeah,
that's a good word, that are different parts of her, that emphasize different parts of her complex, complete symbol. And the implication here on some level is that Loki is actually a feminine figure, symbolically, because he explores chaos in all of his being. And him being a mother of children is the ultimate true example of the feminine creative force, which is the underpinning of the feminine symbol. And the destructive side is also there, and it's also necessary. But the creative aspect is really, I think, the underpinning of the feminine symbol. And Loki would not be nearly as complete an example of feminine symbolism without that. And so Loki, if anyone, is really that example of someone who is truly, truly bending gender norms here by fully and completely embracing that side of symbolism.
For sure. And it's something that we talk about often with the archetypes, is that feminine doesn't necessarily mean female. And so I think this, like Loki, I think is the best example of that, because Loki has a lot of these feminine traits that, but he's not a woman. In the stories, he's definitely a man. There is some, because of his feminine nature, I would say there's some androgyny there, but we are seeing that he is considered a man and held to the same standards as the men around him. So I think it's safe to assume that he's a man. But it's interesting, and something I was thinking about, because he's called Father of Wolves, but he also gave birth to Sleipnir, who's like the epitome of horses. And I was just thinking about the difference between horses and wolves, and that, like, horses are their wealth and their great value, and their food, and their, like, having a horse was a big deal. And so you have Loki giving birth to the best horse, but then you also have him being the father of Fenrir, who's the worst wolf. It really shows that chaotic nature of it, that it can go either way, that it's undifferentiated until it sort of comes into contact with us, and you can have it is both the best and the worst, or capable of the best and the worst at the same time. And in some ways, Odin is similar in that, because you see Odin trying to embrace a lot of the feminine qualities of the archetype, because he wants to be complete and have a complete knowledge. So there is some of that androgyny as well, so that he can just know everything. It's an interesting and complicated relationship between the masculine and feminine archetypes. Between these two gods were probably the most complicated examples of these archetypes.
Oh, definitely. And this is what we're really exploring, right? And I mean, this is certainly tied to a complex modern issue, right? But in the context of the way the society was at the time, the symbolism starts to work itself out a little bit better, especially in the way that they portray it. And the only other thing I'll say is that we really have lost the why behind the social norms, like you were saying a little bit there. And I mean, I think the understanding was, sometimes, Björn and Sven, they're going to go off on their fishing trip and be so much happier afterwards, but they still were expected to have wives and bear children, right? And so, maybe this was something that they knew was going on and whatnot. And behavior is behavior, but they still had to live within the bounds of society. And we no longer have nearly the same level of obligation to that. And so all that's left is this remnant which says this behavior is wrong, but no one can point to why, right? So anyone who believes that really can't point to a why they believe that, whether it's the doctrine of the major Abrahamic religions, or whether it's just some kind of general bent towards conservatism in general. It's really hard to point to why that belief would ever have been held in the first place. And so understanding it at least means that there was originally a reason why this was encouraged or discouraged. And I think that makes it better, because having a reason at least means that and the reason being the success of the tribe and the survival of the tribe, that is something. That's a reason to say, okay, everyone has to do their part. And now these days there isn't that necessity for that. And so the why is lost, and we have this societal conflict as a result.
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating actually to see it in stories that are so old, and see how it's changed and how it still plays a major role in our society. No, another one of those things that I like to see, like, oh, we're still dealing with this, you know. Shall I continue on?
Let's do it.
So this will be stanzas 25 and 26. Oh, no, sorry, 25 to 28. And Frigg begins speaking. Back to the poem. Frigg said, "You should not discuss your histories openly in front of everyone. Whatever you two gods went about doing in your younger days, that belongs in the past and should stay there." Loki said, "Silence, Frigg, you're Fjorgyn's girl, and you've always been lustful. Think of when you, Odin's wife, accepted both Vilr and Ve into your embrace." Frigg said, "You know, if I had a son like Balder sitting here with me in Aegir's hall, in the presence of these gods, I declare you would never come out alive. You'd be killed shortly." Loki said, "You must want me to recount even more of my mischief, Frigg. After all, I'm the one who made it so that Balder will never ride home again."
Heavy little interaction there for sure. First, Frigg sort of re-emphasizes what we were just saying here in the sense that, yeah, you guys can have done these things in the past, but as long as you're not doing it now, and really that just does point to the way social norms are enforced is through discouraging behavior. Essentially, is how the social norms would have been enforced, and here, you know, Frigg is saying, you know, whatever you guys did, that's fine, but no need to talk about it, right? And I mean, maybe that brings up something like, you know, keeping things all bottled up, and certainly that can be an issue for some people, but in this case, it's really, that would have been how the society would have maintained itself, is, you know, on the surface, certainly. I don't want to necessarily imply that this would be a good thing in all cases, but on the surface, they're saying, okay, here's how everyone has agreed. Here's how everyone has agreed to behave and interact together in order to create this tribe that is greater than the sum of the individual people. We are accomplishing things, and we are going to survive. And so these behaviors that Frigg is referencing here, that Odin and Loki talked about, you know, if they were things that they did in the past, or even I would say are ongoing, it's definitely don't talk about it sort of thing, because it's kind of for the good of the tribe there. But then Loki again is, this is getting repetitive in the case where he's calling all the women lustful, which is, well, that I think to me just emphasizes that is the specific behavior that they discourage in women in general. Now, the interesting thing here is that he's saying that Frigg took Odin and Vilr and Ve, which were understood to be either hypostases of Odin or his brothers or something like that, and Frigg took them all into her embrace. And what I see from that is something like, either she tried out different aspects of Odin and she eventually landed on Odin, that's the one who she's going to pick ultimately, or she tried out different brothers, which could be kind of a similar thing in the sense of maybe these three brothers are all showing similar behaviors, but she picks the one that's the best in Odin at the end of the day. And I find that almost very, very interesting symbolically, but almost poetic in the sense that she's the one doing the picking, right? And maybe without Frigg having picked Odin, maybe he wouldn't have been the one who eventually succeeded and was the top god. And I think that shows something about the role of the women choosing the best man. He's the one who's going to succeed. He's the one who's going to be the top, and he's the one whose children are going to eventually rule after he's gone, sort of thing, right? Like, that's a significant decision. And this essentially talks about the process of that happening, I think. It's fascinating.
It is a fascinating little exchange, because I was wondering too that, Villiers and Vey, I was thinking, well, generally they're understood to be just, aspects of Odin or hypostasis. I can't say it right. But sort of like Odin just in different forms. And then Frigg being sort of like she is, I think in some place called the All Mother, sort of one of the mother figures, even though she definitely doesn't have the chaotic elements that we see in Loki, sort of the chaotic and creative elements. But I wonder if we are seeing sort of the evolution of Odin in this exchange, in that there were these different aspects at the beginning of their understanding of the world, probably thousands of years before this story was told. And as the understanding of the world developed, Odin sort of became the primary one of the three, because he embodied what Villiers embodies and what Vey embodies, and or they all morphed into one, but at one point they were three separate ones, and Frigg had been with all of them. It's so there's a lot of questions, not a lot of answers, but I can definitely see how symbolically she would have been with three, or there would have been different ways this could have happened, where yes, she was with all three of them and eventually chose Odin. And then Frigg calls back to her son Balder, who was the best and brightest god, who was the best of the male, or the masculine through Odin, his father, and feminine through Frigg, his mother, and sort of was the son of both, and the son of two opposing forces, so that you get the best of both worlds. And he was the epitome of that. And Loki reminds her that he was the one who killed him, or at least set things in motion to kill him. He wasn't the one who actually killed Balder, it was Hode, but he gave blind Hode the dart of mistletoe to use against Balder. And just like in terms of the story, we're seeing Loki, like he's just getting to depths of, like, that's almost like an evil thing to say to a mother, like reminding her of her dead son. Like that's like, we're really getting into like, he's been calling everyone lustful, but this is one of the ones where it's like, also I killed your son. Remember that, and how bad you felt? That's a big deal. And that, again, I think Frigg is right. Yes, Balder would have killed him by now, but he's not here because Loki killed him.
And obviously this is a story that we've covered before, and we'll cover more again in more detail. But that's one of the most significant stories in all of Norse mythology, is the death of Balder. On a symbolic level, on importance to the story level, it's just can't be overstated how significant that is. And I think we don't necessarily have any kind of other confirmation that Loki really is the one involved there until here, right? And I think that's significant in that, maybe this is the first time that he's revealing it publicly, right? Maybe it was another one of those stories that no one talked about, right? They all know that Loki was responsible, but maybe he never said it, or maybe he always says it, but anyway. So yeah, he's just laying into Frigg here, and again, just twisting the knife all the time, right? Like he's not holding back whatsoever.
Not at all. Shall I continue? This will be stanzas 29 to 32. And Freya begins speaking. Back to the poem. Freya said, "You are mad, Loki, when you boast of your sins. I believe that Frigg knows everyone's fate, even if she never speaks of it." Loki said, "Silence, Freya. You are not free from faults. I know you too well. You've played the whore with every god and every elf who sits in this hall. Freya said, You speak lies, and soon this kind of talk will cause you real trouble. The gods are angry at you, and all the goddesses too. You will go home friendless. Loki said, Silence, Freya, you are a witch and have dealt out many curses. I hear the gods found you lying with your brother, and that you farted then, Freya.
So now he's getting vulgar too. And Freya certainly has a reputation and a symbolic role of being a fertility goddess, and of course she, by extension, has been with many of the men and male figures of the realm. But she's also that is her role. That is her symbolic role, and it's not really an insult to say that she has done those things. It is an insult to say she's played the whore with every god and elf. And just with our modern understanding of elves, that could be really funny. But but in the symbolism here as ancestors, something like that, if that's what we're going with, which I think that's our best guess anyway. That's at least a little bit, well, that's less funny anyway. But it's still insulting, right? And Freya kind of deflects that. She says that he's speaking lies. So I think she's sort of denying the level of what he's trying to say here, but it's still it's pretty apparent what he's doing. And then he gets vulgar. She lies with her brother and farted. Like now he's just bringing out the toilet humor.
Definitely, we'll see more of that as we go on. The one of the things that Loki is doing, I think he's doing well, is that he is taking truths, but he's twisting them so that you can't necessarily defend against the actual charge because it did happen, but it didn't happen in that way. And the context is the important part, because there is an understanding that Frey and Freya were together, and this was the part I was mentioning with the Hierogamous. It's pronounced bunch of different ways, but in that you had Frey, who is in a lot of ways is the divine masculine, has to do with fertility. When you see his statues, he's always got an enormous phallus because he's that fertility god. And you've got Freya, who's the divine feminine, and yes, sort of that sexual energy, that all of the things that complement the things that Frey has, all the things that Freya rules over the complementing feminine side of it. And it's not uncommon for gods who represent these types of things to sort of like be in the same family and then also to engage in incest. And it's one of those things, and we're seeing it here, is that incest for the tribe on a human level is bad. There's no argument there. It's bad. On a symbolic and divine level, they aren't constrained by the same realities that genetics are constrained by. So symbolically, it works, and it's kind of weird, but you kind of get past it and just like, yes, this is how the gods do it. And because it's very necessary, you wouldn't be able to have a prosperous crop one year, a prosperous harvest through Frey if Freya's earth isn't properly fertilized and by Frey. It doesn't work that way. So I think this is sort of how they figured out how it works, and it makes sense that they're family. And I don't know why they would have picked like brother and sister rather than husband and wife, other than, it's a very close relationship between, rain and things growing out of the earth. Like it's just, they go together. There's no, you can't have one without the other. So I wonder if it has something to do with that. But so we're seeing Loki here speak to that, but taking it out of context and sort of understanding it in a way that it's not meant to be understood, and using that as an insult. And how do you, like, as soon as if you're in an argument like this, as soon as you start trying to explain yourself, you've lost, because you're not using the witty comeback or whatever. It's not cool and sexy. It's not like the catchphrase. It's, well, no, actually, this is how it works, and you've lost people already.
Well, I mean, I think that may be why they have to have different people kind of step up and, okay, now I'm gonna take my turn with Loki, and I'll be the target for him for a bit, and so he has to keep moving on, and he doesn't necessarily get to go into that with any one of them. But yeah, this one with Freya is very personal, and maybe one of the worst things that he's accused someone of. What he accuses Odin of is also like pretty significant as well. But incest between brother and sister is quite something. But yeah, he misses the point. He misses the symbolic significance, and maybe that's even something that maybe your average listener at the time might not have understood completely as well either. And so maybe there's an aspect of he's understanding the world, the mythological world, a little too literally, which some others might do at the time. And by portraying it this way, they can at least show that Loki is getting some things wrong, and maybe this was an explaining tool, something like that. And I think it's pretty clear that this is one of the later poems. Like, this wasn't developed thousands of years ago, this particular story necessarily.
No, for sure.
In that he's referencing very many specific details. I think this would have been one of the more recent innovations, sort of thing, and possibly to explain or to put some context to Loki's ultimate fate. But
for sure, and explains why this particular poem is one of the ones that was not very popular or well loved. Like, we have it because it survived, but it wasn't a fan favorite by any stretch. Moving on, stanzas 33 to 36. And now Njorth will take a crack at Loki. Back to the poem. Njorth said, "It is a small matter whether women sleep with their own men or others, but it's a surprise to hear such a sissy god talking here when he's born children." Loki said, "Silence, Njorth. You were sent from the west as a hostage for the gods. The daughters of Hymir used your mouth as a urinal, and you've tasted plenty of piss." Njorth said, "I had some good from that when I was sent from the west as a hostage for the gods. I fathered a son beloved by all, considered a hero among gods." Loki said, "Stop this now, Njorth. Control yourself. I will not conceal this any longer. I know that you fathered that son, Frey, with your own sister, and I expect you've done even worse."
So yeah, just keeping the same level of humor here. Njorth being the father of Freyr and Freya, and would have been in one sense the kind of the head Bonnier at the time, and he was the one who was sent back to the Aesir to live and all this stuff. Yeah, the being used as a urinal is quite something to imply, and Njorth deflects that pretty well. Some good came from him being sent as a hostage, sort of thing, and doesn't really get to whether he had to experience some unpleasantness. But I think the key here is that Njorth fathering his son with his own sister, that's a bit that gets into something else here. We again have already touched upon a little bit the symbolic significance of this, of incest between brother and sister. It's not the same thing, and again, Loki just taking it literally. But Njorth, his sister, is possibly Nerthus, which is an even older goddess who we don't really see much in in the Norse tradition, but she's attested, especially in Tacitus's Germania, but also through the archaeological record, there are these symbols of who is likely Nerthus based on descriptions. And she was like really the top fertility goddess at the time, and she was revered. She was this Mother Earth type goddess. And Njord and Nerthus, it's been speculated whether Nerthus kind of turned into Njord and turned into a male figure somehow for some reason. I find it more plausible that they were a brother sister pair. I find that the most plausible, in that Njord was like the original fertility god, Nerthus was the original fertility goddess, and maybe out of something like the war of the Aesir and Vanir and integrating them together, they needed children in order to have kind of a next and contemporary generation, something like that. And then Njord eventually becomes the master of ships and seafaringness, and that may or may not have been his original role. Maybe his original role was something like Nerthus was the goddess of the land, he was the god of the sea, and the sea goes and makes the rain, things like that. All of this stuff could have kind of come together there. That's partial speculation, but not really. We do have good understanding that Nerthus existed, and this is a pretty good pointer to, again, the Heros Gamos of Njord and Nerthus together, and that they were a significant part of the ancient Germanic religion.
Absolutely. And I'm really coming around to the idea that Loki is taking things with mythological significance out of context and sort of showing up, like using it as a teaching aid that you wouldn't, if you were a human person, you wouldn't want to emulate the gods in these fashions because you are not divine yourself. You have to live in as a human and live by sort of human conventions. I do think I want to talk a little bit about Njord being held hostage for the gods, because there is especially in the pre-Christian world, there was an idea that like being captured in war was one of the worst things that could happen to you, because you should have fought and died for your freedom. In fact, like going back to Aristotle, he talks about the capability of rational and reasonable thinking, and slaves and servants that have been captured in war at the very bottom, because if they had any sense, they would have fought to the death and not been taken, not been captured. And so I think that's sort of one of the knocks against Njord, is that he didn't fight to the death. He agreed to be taken as hostage. Although someone went from the Aesir as well, if I recall, it was an idea that they both have someone who's important, so they'll stop fighting. And marriage actually became a major way of doing that. I guess it was a more fancy way of exchanging hostages, because you wouldn't go to war with your own daughter. But also the insult here, I was wondering as I was reading it, like, how would that go down today? Like, if you were having an argument with someone and you're just, oh, your mouth's been used as a urinal. Like, I actually think that it would be fairly effective in shocking the person, and like, you just wouldn't expect it. And it's pretty graphic here. I get the feeling that Dr. Crawford didn't do much in the way of massaging the translation here. Like, he just put it how it was. But yeah, and again, we see incest with the Vanir, which is interesting. And I think it's because they were more the nature gods, and so many things in nature are so closely intertwined that I can see how you would get incest out of that symbolically.
Yeah, the whole thing is unique, and I think it only really makes sense on the mythological level in the fact that they are the two greatest figures symbolizing the divine mother and the divine father, something like that. If they are those figures, their children are also going to be these immense great figures, and so on and so forth on a symbolic level, right? On a human level, that's how you get birth deformities.
Absolutely.
So that's probably something that people tried, and yeah, it didn't work out so good.
No, there's a lot of tales of, past royalty in various kingdoms and countries that, had weird defects that the like painters wouldn't include in the portraits, but in the in the accounts of their death, they're dying from like weird things. You're just like, well, how did that happen? So, and then it's like, oh, yes, their genetic variance wasn't strong enough, and so weird things start happening.
Yeah, so it's again one of those things that we probably shouldn't emulate literally, but on a symbolic level, it makes a lot of sense.
For sure. Shall I move on?
Let's do it.
All right. Stanzas 37 to 40. And Tyr is going to step up. Back to the poem. Tyr said, Frey is the best of all the gods in the holy halls of Asgard. He doesn't make girls weep, nor cause trouble for women. He frees captives from their chains. Loki said, Silence, Tyr. You don't know how to settle disputes between men. I'm thinking of your right hand, which Fenrir, my son, bit off. Tyr said, I lost that hand, you lost that son. We both suffered loss. Your son isn't doing well either. He remains forever in chains, waiting for Ragnarok. Loki said, Silence, Tyr. Or don't you know your own wife had a son by me, you poor fool? I'll never pay you a penny in compensation for that.
Again, referencing some significant stories here, and I mean that's I think why this one is such an interesting poem here is not only that it's Loki being the biggest jerk he possibly can be, but he's also poking at and almost trying to undermine some of the key stories, like the death of Balder or the hostage taking of Njord, and here Tyr and Fenrir. Like he's almost undermining the good and glorious. For in a tragic story, it's different, but he's undermining the common understanding of these important central myths. Subverting, that's a good way to put it. He's subverting the conventional understanding of these stories by casting them in a negative light or admitting to the dark origins of these of how these came about, like Loki admitting to killing Balder, or at least causing him to be killed, sort of thing, right? And here he's admitting that he is related to Fenrir. Fenrir is his son, right? He's admitting to being the father of the character that's going to or has taken the hand from Tyr, and that's its own key story on its own in the sense that Tyr shows his commitment to justice by offering up his hand in order so that Fenrir can be chained, right? And he takes a significant loss for it. And Loki, of course, is making fun of that here. But Tyr, I think, actually, this is the best parry I've seen so far. This is like, yeah, I might have lost that hand, but you lost your son. He's not doing so well. And that's almost sort of like understanding the risk-reward equation. Tyr was willing to give up his hand, but what they did was they chained chaos for a while. They chained the ultimate destruction that Fenrir represented, at least for a while. And now Loki's here stirring that up, and maybe that points to they weren't quite so successful. Maybe they literally chained Fenrir, but Loki, his father, is still out there.
No, definitely. It's Yeah, I agree. I definitely agree. It's sort of one of the best comebacks that we've seen in the story. And something he said that I found interesting, that Tyr said, was that he doesn't make girls weep nor cause trouble for women. However, and it'll be mentioned in a bit, but when Frey wanted to marry Gerda, he sent Skirnir, right? Yeah, it was in the Skirnir Small, to go and sort of fetch her. And maybe it wasn't Frey that was awful to Gerda, but Skirnir certainly was. And so it's interesting. I don't want to think that Tyr might be stretching the truth here a little bit himself, because, I mean, he gave up his hand for truth and justice. But I do wonder, because they do mention, like, the story is known within this story of Skirnir. So I don't know. That's one of the questions I had when I was reading this. And then with Loki referencing Tyr losing his hand, it made me think of the willfully blind king. And, he's saying, you don't know how to settle disputes between men. I'm thinking of your right hand. Well, that might just be that Tyr became willfully blind and then was not able to settle disputes. And that was one of the things that led to him sort of being taken off the top of the dominance hierarchy. He certainly didn't fall all the way down, but he was no longer at the very top of it. And I wonder if that's part and parcel of it.
I agree, and it's a fundamental story in many other mythologies, the idea of the willfully blind king, but we don't really see it emphasized nearly as much here in the Norse. And I think Tyr is the best fit for that, because they let Fenrir grow and grow and grow, and his potential for destruction grew and grew and grew. And only when he was too big to deal with without deception did they being all the gods in general, but Tyr perhaps being the most responsible, because Tyr fed him, right? Tyr, I think, is the most responsible here in this situation. And so they let him grow too big, and someone had to deal with it. And maybe part of why Tyr still has his place is that he took the responsibility for it in the end, but then he's maimed and is not fully functional anymore. And he can't be the top god anymore if he has that sort of deficiency now. Not to put that to, of course, there are many people, especially veterans, who have lost limbs and body parts and things like that, and do great, fantastic things in society. Life would be a lot easier for all of them if they were whole.
For sure.
Right. And so Odin then takes the place at the top, but Tyr is still an important god, and his role is very interesting. The role of the willfully blind king would be very interesting if that's actually the true parallel here. And then his wife, the reference to Tyr's wife, she is unknown. This is the only time she's ever referenced. So unfortunately, it's another one of those we can't really speak to this one.
No, I did find something interesting, though. And it's a clue. It's not a for sure thing. But in the works done by Jacob Grimm, he's found a goddess named Zissa, which is the sort of the counterpart to the name Tyr. I think it's like Zu, like Z-I-U or something, but it's the feminine counterpart of the word Tyr. And so he kind of suggests that it's his wife, and she was a goddess that actually had a feast day, September 28th, and she was honored because the tribe that honored her or saw Zissa as someone who was important and a goddess, they defeated the Romans and pushed them back. And so that victory was celebrated on September 28th and was dedicated to her. So we don't know for sure that it's his wife, but we do know that Zissa like existed in terms of at least stories about her, and there was celebrations in her honor. But that's like that's about all we have. It's neat, but yeah.
Yeah, we can't go into too much more detail on it, right? But and there's no reference to her in Norse. I'm assuming.
No, there's no other reference. There's no reference to her in Norse mythology at all. It's Jacob Grimm has a small like thing about her in one of his works.
No, and he's great. He did a lot of fantastic work on finding little references like that. So I'm sure that's right. But yeah, we can't go into too much more on the story of Loki potentially having a son by him though. So
no, that we don't know.
Loki, I got that wrong. Loki fathering a son by. Never mind. I'm sure you understood what I was getting at.
Loki being the father of Tyr's son, basically Loki cuckolding Tyr.
Yeah.
Actually, we should probably talk a little bit about that's a big thing too. Like, again, you'd get killed for that. Like that's, and I think the wife gets killed too. Like it's that is one of the big. All of these things have been big no-nos, but like cuckolding, like dead. You're sentenced to death, and that's it. Like.
So Loki's earned a few death sentences already.
For sure, yeah. Well, and we do see sort of what his fate will be because of all this. Shall I move on? All right, stanzas 41 and 42, and now Frey steps into it. Frey said, "I see that wolf sitting and drooling till Ragnarok comes, and you'll be the next one chained up, you evildoer, if you don't close your mouth." Loki said, "You had to pay money to get yourself a bride, and you gave up your famous sword. When the giants ride to Asgard, you won't be able to fight."
Yeah, this one is referencing Skirnismal and some foreshadowing as well, foreshadowing on what Loki's fate might end up being. But this is referencing Skirnismal, and yeah, I don't want to get into too much more detail on that, honestly, because we've covered that one significantly in our episode on Skirnismal. So that would be what I would reference if you want a little bit more detail on that. But the key bits are that yes, Freyr sent Skirnir out to get Gerda as a bride for Freyr, and he ended up giving away some money and his sword. He gave his sword to Gerda, which is symbolic, I think, of the idea that testosterone drops significantly in men and their will to fight by extension kind of goes way down, and that could be a symbolic reference to that. And then the idea here is that he's not able to fight at Ragnarok, that Frey will not be able to fight. And I think he does fight at Ragnarok, but maybe he was not effective enough to survive at something like that. That is what ends up happening. So that's a story all to its own. But Loki is, again, still pushing buttons, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. The only thing I'll add is that the sword was famous because it could fight on its own, and it would have been the sword to defeat Surt, who is the fire giant who burns everything. Like it would have stopped Ragnarok in its tracks. So yeah, it's kind of a big deal that Frey gave this up, but he did get his wife. So
yeah, again, on a symbolic level, it's funny. It's sort of like single men have the potential for violence, and they can cause a lot of destruction, but they can also be the force that defends against, incoming invasions and things like that. And if they all get paired up, there's much less incentive to go off to war. There's much more incentive to stick around and be the provider, sort of thing. And that is what happened to Freyr by that symbolic shorthand, which is a really good one. I like it a lot. I like the idea that he gives away his sword, and the sword could have, but it's definitely something that they're so in tune with the way the world works here by understanding that enough to have a symbolic shorthand of just he gave up his sword, and it makes perfect sense. It makes exactly the right sense here, and
Absolutely.
it's just great that they did that.
Shall I continue? Stanzas 43 to 46, and Frey's servant Bigvir begins to speak. Bigvir said, "If I had a noble family in a grand hall like Frey does, I beat this liar down to his marrow, break every bone and limb in him." Loki said, "Who's this little fellow wagging his tail, scavenging for master's scraps? You're always in your master's ear, always twittering away while doing your mindless work." Bigvir said, "I am named Bigvir, and all the gods and men say I'm brave. I'm proud to say that all the gods are enjoying their beer here." Loki said, "Silence, Bigvir. You don't know how to serve food to guests, and worse than that, I know that we can find you hiding in the straw when battles start."
So again, fighting words here, and even the servants now are getting bold enough to challenge Loki, because I'm pretty sure by this point they know he has gone and done it. He's in trouble, and there's probably not going to be any repercussions for a servant speaking up, because a servant was killed earlier. Loki killed a servant earlier, and so all that either of them can muster is just like it's breaking down now. Loki's he's not able to give these like massive jabs anymore. It's like the best he can do is say, "Oh, you are doing your mindless work as a servant," and the worst he can say is he's hiding in the straw when the battle starts. And Bugvir says he's brave, right? So Bugvir is challenging that assertion that he is not brave preemptively, I suppose. And again, that just points to the importance of bravery and going off the fight that it would have been for men. But honestly, now it's deteriorating. Loki is losing his grip here. He's running out of targets because no one's willing to engage him.
Absolutely, because it's gone past that point where like talking is over, and we're definitely going to get to the point where the talking is over and it's time for punishment. It's interesting because Bigvir's name, again, I'd mentioned at the very beginning, is like barley processor. And he talks a lot about beer here and, you don't know how to serve food. And I couldn't help but wonder if Bigvir talking about being brave was sort of that bravery that comes with drinking. Like, oh, yeah, I can take all y'all and I'm brave. But then when it actually happens, we can find you in the straw when the battles start. Like, maybe that's Loki telling the truth again. I'm a little surprised that Loki actually addressed the servant. I wonder if he didn't kill him because he is Frey's and there's a certain amount of power there, but which is probably also the reason why Bigvir thought he could speak up against Loki, because he's under Frey's protection. But things are devolving. This really makes me think of the part in the Voluspa when they talk about the age of the wolf and how families break down and societal norms break down. And I guess here's not a bad spot to talk about it, but if a lot of these things that Loki is saying are true, then that means on an individual basis, a lot of people are going against societal norms and things are breaking down. And it made me think of the Gulag Archipelago. Why can't I speak for this episode? Archipelago, where like everyone was at fault for how bad things got in Soviet Russia, and that 2 out of 3 people were informants to the authorities, and that emphasis that Solzhenitsyn, see, I can say that fine, the emphasis he puts on the individual, making sure that they're good, and not to make this reference, but like that their room is clean, right? That they're taking care of themselves. And if what Loki is saying is true, or even if half of it, what he's saying is true, we're seeing that deterioration, and that is sort of, that deterioration is sort of exactly what leads to something like Ragnarok, where everything falls apart and something new has to come up.
Right. Yeah. It's that's actually really, yeah, that's poignant because it's, if everyone in society is collectively got these things, and maybe there's the other side to it too, where, you maybe society is always rotten, you know what I mean? But it's when it gets to a certain level, something like that. And wasn't it Stephen King's It, that where the entire town was rotten, and the that clown was like the symbol of all the rottenness that was in the town, and it had to be cleaned up by the new generation of children and things like that. I really like that movie. I should watch it again.
Yeah, that was a good reference. I'm like, that's great. And it was the new generation who had to like take care of it. And also that story about Lot's wife, where in the Bible, where Lot has to find, he's begging God not to just wipe the city out. And he's like, oh, if I can find 100 good people, will you save the city? And God's like, sure, no problem. But he can't find 100 people. And then it deteriorates until it's like, I can't find one person that's worth saving. And it's like, okay, like leave and don't look back. And then Lot's wife looks back and turns into a pillar of salt as the city is like wiped off the planet. And it's the same idea that it had deteriorated so much. Even Noah's Ark, like it had deteriorated so much, they had to like start over. So it's kind of a common, it's a very common theme that when you see that degradation of sort of interpersonal relationships, that's the foundation of any society is the relationships between people. And when that breaks down, well, it doesn't take long for all of it to topple, and you get that, the world as the society knows it is over.
Exactly. And it's definitely, Loki is exposing this, and maybe the gods don't like it, but yeah, he's playing a role here. It's not a good one, not a happy role. Not good, and I say good in the sense of like moral good. He's not playing a moral good role, but he's playing a role here to expose this, maybe. And the stories that have happened here, the death of Balder already having happened, like Ragnarok is on its way. So
for sure, it's almost like Loki has decided to be the comeuppance for the gods. If some of these stories are true, some of them, there's one coming up that we can verify isn't true the way Loki tells it. But like maybe he is sort of the, they used to call, I think it was Attila the Hun, the scourge of God. And it wasn't that he was scourging God. It was God was using Attila the Hun to punish the people who weren't, living righteous lives. So I do wonder if this is sort of the, almost like divine retribution, or at least the, Loki's almost being the consequences, like the universal consequences of these actions. Like if you do this, this is what happens. And there's not really anything you can do about it. It's just a matter of when does the consequence hit you. Shall I move on?
let's go.
Stanzas 47 and 48. Heimdall speaks up now. Back to the poem. Heimdall said, "You're drunk, Loki, drunk to the point of foolishness. Why don't you control yourself? This kind of drunkenness makes every man say more than he means to." Loki said, "Silence, Heimdall. In the old days, a miserable fate was assigned to you. You have to stand all the time, stay watchful all the time as the guardian of the gods."
So another reference to drunkenness, and I think that we don't have to go into that too much more on the drunkenness side. It's generally considered bad form to become all that much drunk. But Heimdall, this is interesting. It's again, Loki's flipping it on his head here. Heimdall, in theory, has this honorable position of being the guardian of the gods, and he's the one who watches the Rainbow Bridge Bifrost, and he he is the one who is going to sound the Gjallar horn to indicate that Ragnarok has started, right? He's important, and he's got his ear in, like he's listening to the unknown. He's seeing, he's watching, but Loki calls that a miserable fate. And you know what? Maybe on some level that is, but he's flipping it on its head, right? He's not even really going at any one thing in particular here. He's just saying that, yeah, your life doesn't look all that fun or awesome, and just sort of pointing that out and throwing that out there. And it's interesting because Heimdall is drastically important, and also has some rules that we'll look at in future poems that are much different from just his role as a guardian. But Loki is saying, hey, well, maybe even something to the effect of, I wouldn't want that. So yeah.
I just had this thought, because it's not, Loki actually isn't insulting him. He's just saying, like, it's almost sympathetic. It's like, you know, in the old days, well, you got assigned to, like, that is rough. And Heimdall, like in the Lay of Rig, we see him set up society, right? I wonder if Heimdall's task in this context is protecting the societal norms and the mores of society that Loki's pointing out all of these gods broke. And now he's looking at Heimdall and being like, that is a tough job. This sucks. Like for you, because you've had to try and keep all of these people in line, because you're the guardian of them. And look what they've done. And it's falling apart.
Yeah, the real meaning of this entire story is quite something. This is heavy. This is not a light story.
No, it isn't. It's funny because when we recorded this, it's the episode after the fate of Aino, which another heavy story. And then when I was reading this, I'm like, oh man, like, can we get a break here? Like, can Luke and I get a break here? Because these stories have been heavy. And and just like reading that, I was just like, oh, like, you really get that sense that the end is coming, and it's all about to fall apart. All the good stuff is about to go away. And yeah, it just gets worse. On a lighter note, I did think it was pretty funny that when Heimdall speaks, he basically quotes the Havamal in that last, this kind of drunkenness makes every man say more than he means. So I was like, yeah, I've read that exact line. Like, but yeah, so here, yeah, it's a neat little section in this poem, because Loki isn't insulting Heimdall. He's almost sympathizing with him that, yeah, you got it rough. Like, you did not get a good job at the beginning.
No, Heimdall's a great character, and we'll see more of him later. But he doesn't get the best insult from Loki here, because maybe he is one of those maybe more impenetrable characters. Maybe it does point to the strength of his character.
The other thing too is that during Ragnarok, Heimdall and Loki kill each other, and I know there's some speculation as to whether it was Snorri's way of killing off all the gods in a neat and tidy way to make room for, the Christian god. But this in exchange, I do wonder, it's kind of poetic that they'll be the ones fighting at Ragnarok and they'll kill each other. But while it's almost like, well, they are two opposing forces, because most of the insults that Loki's making, a lot of them, he helped, like all the lustful goddesses. Well, he's saying he knows they're lustful because it was him that they were with. And it's kind of like they're the two like diametrically opposed forces, but you have that moment of almost recognition and respect that I see you, what is it? Great recognizes great, or something like that. Yeah. No, it's a neat spot in the poem. Shall I continue? All right. Stanzas 49 to 52. And now Skathi is going to speak up. Back to the poem. Skathi said, "This is fun for you, Loki, but you won't be speaking as a free man much longer. The gods will bind you to the rock with the cold guts of your own son. Loki said, You know, even if the gods were going to bind me to the rock with the cold guts of my own son, I was still first and last on the battlefield when we fought your father Thiassi. Skadi said, You know, even if you were first and last on the battlefield when the gods fought against Thiassi, you will never be welcome in any home or other place where I have power. Loki said, You had kinder words for me when you were begging me to join you in your bed. But one expects as much when one speaks openly about such hidden shames.
Woof.
Wow.
Yeah, that's direct, nail on the head kind of stuff here, right? And well, obviously we both read this previously, but then just when we're in the act of actually going through this so deep, that's like, bam, that's exactly what we've just been talking about. And again, it's a little more preamble and more foreshadowing. He's going to be tied up on a rock with the cold guts of his own son. I wonder if that's going to happen. But then it's just kind of this things that have happened where Loki plays a negative role, right? Like he is on the battlefield against her father Thiassi, who was a giant, and I think it is ultimately Skadi accepts that, but takes her place with the gods as compensation, essentially. So it works out well for her. And then again, Loki's just kind of like, well, you wanted me to come join you in your bed, so at the end of the day, I think, again, his comebacks are weakening because if that's the best he can say, if he's telling the truth, that's significant. And that's, I think, where it's poignant, where he says, he's speaking openly about such hidden shames, right? If the gods are actually being, well, if all the goddesses have slept with Loki, sort of thing, I mean, that's kind of, that's quite something. But maybe he really is exposing the dark underbelly of the gods. And no, I'm seeing the purpose and the role of this poem in a new light, having gone through it so deeply and seeing what he's actually doing. And it's not without a goal. He's being a jerk, to put it lightly, but it's still with a goal.
Definitely. It's weird when I was reading this, for some reason it reminded me, and I haven't watched it in a while, but it reminded me of, like, I don't know, the last few episodes of the series Breaking Bad, where this is a tragedy, as is Breaking Bad, especially like in the Greek sense, where everything is set in play and you kind of know how it's going to end, but you're watching it unfold, and that's the tragic part, because you know how it's going to end, and you're just watching all the details like fall apart and come together in ways that are just going to be terrible. And so we're kind of seeing that. And again, you mentioned, like, we don't have any record of Skadi and Loki, getting together in such a personal way. But, there's no real way to disprove it either, right? That we don't have the record, but that's not to say that the story doesn't exist. And then you could go even further down the rabbit hole and say, even if the story doesn't exist, does that mean that it didn't happen? Like, it may very well have, but we don't know. So there's, even back then, there could be this ambiguity where it's like, oh, well, did they or didn't they? Shall I move on?
Yeah, and yeah, go.
So stanzas 53 and 54. Then Sif came forward and offered Loki a drink of mead and said, Hail to you now, Loki. Take this drink I offer you for our good old mead. Do this rather than find fault with me, alone among all the gods and goddesses. Loki drained the drink and said, You would be unique, Sif, if you actually were wary and unwelcoming to other men. But I alone know how you were unfaithful to your husband Thor, and I was the one you slept with.
And again, this is just doubling down and doubling down. It's like, and so I picture this as like he downs this drink, and you know the mead that I like to drink is like really strong. It gets you drunk quick. And I mean, like he's already said to be drunk. Like he's just going. Like he must be almost obliterated at this point. But then it's like, hey, I slept with you too, and it's just yeah, it's devolving, and maybe Sif is being a little naive. I mean, she's Thor's wife, right? And she's maybe trying not to find fault with me. Like she just seems like the perfect foil to Thor, right? Where she's just nice and gentle and caring, kind, all that, right? But Loki just keeps downing the drinks and keeps on saying he slept with everyone in the room.
And with this one, there is the story of Sif and her golden hair, that Loki cut off her flowing locks, her natural flowing locks, and it was the feature about Sif that Thor found most attractive. He loved her beautiful hair, and so you would ask, well, how did Loki get access to her hair, and how did she let him cut it off? And the story goes that she had fallen asleep. But that's what the story says, right? So it's like Loki's even got me like questioning like the actual story that we have that survives, that she fell asleep and that Loki cast a spell on her to make sure that she wouldn't wake up while he shaved her head. But you know, he said it enough times, and it's sort of that idea about if you tell a lie enough times, you might start believing it, right?
Yeah, and I believe like shaving off a woman's hair is like a mark of shame and all that.
Yes.
Like most famously these days in Game of Thrones, Cersei Lannister gets her hair shaved off. Not to spoil it for anyone, we won't talk more about that, but you know.
I'll go down a small rabbit hole because it's interesting. There's a Japanese girls pop band called AKB48 or whatever. One of the rules for them is that they can't have a boyfriend because it ruins the illusion that they're pure but also like available, right? Well, one of the girls was found to have a boyfriend, and she disappeared for like a week and came back with an apology video on YouTube with her head shaved. And it was like, oh my God, like what have they done to this poor girl? Like it was nuts. So yeah, like it still happens in parts of the world, I guess. Like,
I suppose
yeah, no,
so.
and like in the story, like Sif hides from Thor, and Thor's like, "Honey, like it's okay," and then sees her shave, like what happened, and then makes Loki go get her, basically fix the problem, and Loki fixes it by going to the dwarves, who fashion a wig made of gold, and then Sif has like even better hair than before. But that's the story that they're referencing, and you know, it was just the two of them together, right? Like, so there's no witnesses to say, well, no, they didn't sleep together. It's just how the story's been told. Like, Loki's done a great job of sowing like that, just that like little nugget of doubt in all of these stories, even though like with this one we actually have it, but it's still like, well, they were alone, and maybe this is just the story that's told. But I will say that going after Sif and Sif trying to make peace with him, or at least not have Loki go after him, I do feel like it. There's significance there in that this is like the last line that Loki has to cross, because this is Thor's wife, and we know that Thor has no issue with beating Loki and like killing giants. Like, if anything's going to happen, it's going to be because of Thor. So, shall I continue? All right. Stanzas 55 and 56. Phrase other servant Bela began speaking. Back to the poem. Bela said, "Listen, all the mountains are shaking. I think Thor is coming home. He'll close this mouth that's slandering all the gods and men." Loki said, "Silence, Bela, you're Bigvir's wife. You have plenty of other faults. There's no greater beast among the gods here tonight, you lowly milkmaid."
the it's funny when the insults still translate, right? Like your mouth was used as a urinal. There's no greater beast among the gods than you lowly milkmaid. It's, I don't know, just it's funny. But oh, here comes Thor. I don't know. I don't have much more than that. Thor's about to come onto the scene, guys.
Yeah, it's almost like a transition piece. So I'll move on to stanzas 57 and 58, and it's just Thor and Loki now. Then Thor came and said, "Silence, you sissy, or I'll let my hammer silence you instead. I'll knock your head off your shoulders, and then you'll be silent and dead." Loki said, "Thor has come to the hall. But why are you making such a big show of yourself, Thor? I don't think you'll look half so daring at Ragnarok when the wolf swallows your father."
So Thor's on the scene. He's in the hall. And, well, I think things are actually getting serious now. And Thor, what he's saying here, I mean, it's pretty serious. Like, he's going to knock his head off his shoulders. Like, well, I don't know what else is going to happen here. And the best Loki can do is point to the potential flaws or whatever, the potential negatives that might happen to Thor and all that, right? And I mean, we know what happens at Ragnarok. Odin dies, and so does Thor. But Thor dies killing the world serpent. So, I mean, I think he's still doing pretty all right on the bravery front.
For sure. The only other thing I'd like to point out is I guess there's two things. One, silence, you sissy. There's a lot of that coming up. And again, you're seeing that the insults, the only other god that went there with Loki was Odin over that sort of the pervert's way of life. This is sort of speaking to the same thing of being unmanly and engaging in activities that are not considered worthy of a man. And then Thor, we've talked about this before in a bunch of places, but Thor is like above all is the symbol of order and ordering. He's got his hammer as a weapon, which is a tool that's used to build, and Loki. We've also gone from trying to talk Loki out of doing this and basically giving him chance after chance of stopping. But now we've come to the point where we need actual martial power to order him and stop him, which Thor represents sort of like, that's what he is. He's strong and powerful and will order things forcefully. So back to the poem, stanzas 59 and 60. Thor said, "Silence, you sissy, or I'll let my hammer silence you instead. I'll throw you out of here into Jotunheim, and no one will ever see you again." Loki said, "You'll probably never tell any human beings what you've done in Jotunheim. I remember when you sat trembling in a giant's glove. You didn't look much like Thor then."
Silence, you sissy. That's a pretty good. I might start using that in real life.
It's pretty good.
Just when I'm in situations like this, that similar to Thor and Loki sort of thing. Yeah, that's pretty likely, right? But the story they're referencing here, that they were off on Thor and Loki were off on an adventure into Jotunheim, right? And they were staying silent so that a giant would not wake up and find them and kill them, right? They found their way into a giant's glove, and that I think Thor would have found that to be a good bit of camaraderie sort of thing, and they would have had a good time together. And now Loki's ruining it. He's saying, well, you didn't look much like Thor then.
Yeah, and it's the story itself is funny. It's has to do with the giant Skirmir, and he's, in terms of giants, he's enormous because they could literally hide in his glove. And they originally found him sleeping, and Thor was like, "Oh, a giant! He's sleeping. I'm gonna kill him." And so he threw Mjolnir at him and hit him in the head. And Skirmir woke up and said, "Oh, did an acorn fall on my head?" And he went back to sleep. And then Thor was like, "Well, damn, he's not dead. I'm gonna hit him with my hammer again." So he does it again. And Skirmir wakes up again and, oh, are some leaves falling on my head? And then they go off on an adventure, and they meet. It's a very famous story where they meet Utgard Loki, who's the other Loki who, like, outside the tribe, and they say Utgard to differentiate between Loki, who's with Thor on this adventure, and this other Loki who is just happens to have the same name but with like in a different tribe. And then they, with Utgard Loki, they undergo a few trials. They have to eat a bunch of food, try and drink down a horn of mead. They wrestle with an old lady, try and lift a cat. Like it's pretty cool. Like, and they all symbolize things, but at the end, it turns out Utgard Loki is actually Skirmir again, and he says, "Oh, like it's a good thing Thor didn't hit me again with his hammer, because he would have killed me. Like I was this close to dying." And he's actually impressed with how well they fail all the tasks, but he's actually impressed with how well they did, because the tasks were incredible. Like the cat that Thor had to lift was actually the Midgard serpent, and Thor was able to lift a paw of the cat's off the ground. And in reality, he'd actually pulled the Midgard serpent by the tail and had moved it, which is pretty impressive. So Skirmir's like, oh, like that was close, but we tricked him. And then Thor got angry, and Skirmir's like, well, we're never going to see each other again. And he disappears. All that to say, Loki was there and saw all this happen. And he's saying like, oh, you didn't look much like Thor when you were hiding. And it's like, well, that's not actually how it went. Like that's like Thor was taking care of business, and Loki saw it with his own eyes, but here he is being like, oh yeah, he's being cowardly. And so again, he's twisting what actually happened, and there's no context. And other than like Thor, there were two like kids with them, but they can't, they're not there right now. So there's no one to argue with him. It's just Loki's word against Thor's.
Yeah, it's quite the adventure, quite the story, and Loki took something awesome and fun the two of them did together, and now he's making fun of him for it.
Yeah, and actually, like when we cover the story, it's a fun story, and they have like Thor and Loki have fun together. Like it's their buddy. It's basically like a buddy adventure. But yeah, he twists it here. I'll move on to stanzas 61 and 62. Thor said, "Silence you, sissy, or I'll let my hammer silence you instead. With my right hand I'll beat you, break every bone in you." Loki said, "I expect I'll live a long time still, even if you threaten me with that hammer." You thought Utgard Loki's food bag was challenge enough, and you left the contest still hungry.
Another reference to the same story, essentially, and I think it was that Thor was let to eat like as much as he wants, sort of thing, and it never ended. Was that the same? Is that story?
It's that story, but it was Loki was given that challenge.
Oh, right.
Which is one of the things I found confusing about this, because it's like, well, how does that work? But one, it's not. It wouldn't be all that weird if the story that they're referencing, Thor is the one who's eating instead of Loki. Like it could just be like the stories that have survived and were collected weren't necessarily, they weren't necessarily all in the same continuity. It's not like a movie where nowadays we've got people who actually look for continuity errors, but these were stories that were collected. So maybe in the tradition that this story came from, it was Thor that did it. Either way, it is referencing that story. And again, Loki was there and knows exactly what happened, but is messing with the truth. I'll continue. This will finish. Well, at least the poetic part of this. It stanzas 63 to 65. Thor said, "Silence you, sissy, or I'll let my hammer silence you instead. I plan to send you straight to hell beyond the corpse gates." Loki said, I've spoken to the gods and the gods' sons, said everything I dared to say, but it's because of you, Thor, that I'll leave. I know you and you alone mean your threats. You made beer, Aegir, but you'll never again host a feast here. Everything you own will burn up, and you will feel flames on your back.
Well, this is it, right? Thor's final threats, and Loki knows Thor means them. And I think that that's true, right? Thor, he doesn't stand for everything that Loki is doing. And I think he is the one who would transgress hospitality, because what Loki has done and said is just so monstrous that he would take him out. And he's being serious. So Loki's going to leave. But what a way to leave, though. He finally insults the host. He hadn't done that yet. He hadn't touched the host, because that would have just finally violated hospitality, right? Aegir would have, been like, okay, get out, get after him. He's done. And that's it, right? That's it. So this friendship of Thor and Loki's, I think that's over. And I think Loki is going to have some not so nice fate waiting for him.
Absolutely. And one of the neat things about this is we've seen this behavior from Thor before. In the Voluspa, when the gods are making the agreements to stop the war between themselves, between the Aesir and Vanir, I think the Aesir try and get a little tricky with some of the agreements, and Thor will have none of it. He wants them to be honest. He wants it to be orderly, and like he's willing to fight them. And I think that's one of the reasons why Loki knows that Thor will, if he's willing to fight his own father and family in his pantheon, he's certainly willing to, bash in Loki. And so to finish it off, there's a paragraph of prose. And interestingly, both the prose at the beginning of the poem and at the end are from the original manuscript. So that's always a neat tidbit of info. Concerning Loki. After this, Loki hid in the falls of Freyninger in the shape of a salmon, but the gods caught him. He was tied up with the intestines of his son Neri, and his son Narvi was turned into a wolf. Skadi took a poisonous snake and tied it up over Loki. Poison dripped on his face from its mouth. Loki's wife Sigyn sat there and caught the poison in a jar. But when the jar filled, she had to empty it. And when she did, poison dripped on Loki's face. And this hurt him so badly that he trembled, and all the world with him. This is what is called an earthquake.
What a fate for Loki. The argument can definitely be made that he deserved it based on this, everything that he's just done and said. He burned all the bridges. He burned all of them. He insulted everyone, whether he was being truthful or not, it doesn't really matter. And his son Nari gets dismembered. Loki gets tied up with his son's intestines. Isn't that just gruesome? And then you see his wife Sigyn have to stand over top of him with a jar to catch the poison dripping on his face. And Vikings, the TV show Vikings, referenced that exactly with Floki, who his name sounds a lot like Loki for some reason. And they do this, and they do this exact scene, and he's got, I think it's water. I don't think it's actually like that unpleasant for him or anything like that. It's just water dripping on his face, but still, it's like she's holding that up there, and it's her devotion to him that's significant. And it's also significant that he has someone who loves him, who's with him by his side, and that's serious. That's significant too. But this is Loki's fate until Ragnarok, and maybe he deserves it, maybe he doesn't. Maybe he burned some bridges. Maybe he was doing it for a reason the entire time, and maybe he was doing something that is going to sow discord among the gods, and that's going to lead them down the path to ultimate destruction. Or maybe he was just being a jerk. Either way, Here's the fate of Loki.
And what a fate. Like, no wonder like heavy metal bands use imagery from Norse mythology, because this is some good stuff. Like ooh, it's terrifying. Like it's they didn't hold back any punches on like making things awful. Like at least in the imagery of what they're doing and punishing, the evildoers. Yeah, this is really like the stage is pretty much set for Ragnarok now. Like there was no real return after Balder died, but now it's like the time has come now. Like there's even the time for preparation is pretty much over. It's okay. Things have been set in motion, and it's time to just like go through with it. Yeah. And one of the poignant things and sort of the heaviness of the poem, I think, comes from the fact that, well, and it's funny, even the next poem in the Edda sort of goes back to a more fun time where Loki was, one of the comic relief and the funny one, but here it falls apart, and you're seeing the disintegration of the society, and the seed of doubt being planted in it, and people aren't believing or aren't going to believe in the. Well, I guess Loki showed all the cracks in the myth that the society believed in. That it's Socrates' noble lie that for a society to function, you all have to have a foundation that everyone believes in. And you usually try and make it broad enough that you can have a lot of people in it, but tight enough that if it's under attack, you can defend against it because you like the way the society is going. And with this, I think whether or not Loki's telling the truth, he's done enough damage to it that they won't be able to put it back together. There's at least enough doubt. And if what he said is true, then there's there's more than enough like degenerate behavior that it's too late, and something is going to have to happen in order to reconstitute society.
No, he didn't leave the party in a happy place. No one's going to be happy after that. Like, everyone's insulted. Probably many of the women are crying. It's none of this is good. Like, I think I can see this as like the holiday dinner table in movies, like just the typical holiday dinner table where someone insults every member of the family, sort of thing. Like, that's happened. That definitely has happened. I don't have a specific example in mind, but it's in my head. And this is the same thing. And he pokes at just such specific things, and maybe the common thread turns into, oh, well, I slept with all you women, but it's also like he's challenging some of the foundations, and he's challenging the social norm of monogamy, and he's also challenging the everything that came before, where the Vanir, they were these great couples that were the example of fertility and all that, but then he's just saying, well, no, but that you were incestuous brother and sister, like that's just terrible, and calling all the men cowards, calling all the women lustful. It's like the damage is done, and you're right. If it's true, it's society is already kind of on its way down. The individuals, like you said, are ignoring the social norms, and it's just about to break down anyway. But if he wasn't telling the truth, he's at least challenging enough of it he's challenging enough of it to show the potential and show the possibility. And with Baldur's death and Fenrir's chaining, all that was left was Loki. And here it is. The stage is set. Ragnarok is upon us. Hasn't happened yet, theoretically, in our world, but it's upon us. It's ready to go.
Yeah. And with that happy note, I think we'll start with our normal housekeeping at the end of the episodes. If you'd like to, cheer us up after this heavy poem, you should definitely get in touch with us on Facebook, Northern Myths Podcast, on Twitter at Northern Myths. We were both on Twitter ourselves at Northmyth Dan, at Northmyth Luke, on Instagram at Northern Myths Podcast. If you want to support the podcast, like and subscribe and a review on whichever platform you listen to, or if you're on YouTube, comment and subscribe. That really helps us and goes a long way in sort of spreading the word about us. We've also got an Amazon affiliate store where you can get the Poetic Edda by Jackson Crawford or anyone really. Like, we recommend this one, but it is fun to read a bunch of them and see the differences and similarities. Then there's we've also got recommended music. We don't have any recommended movies yet, eh?
Not yet.
Not
That's
yet.
that's a good idea, actually.
Yeah. I don't know what off the top of my head, but yeah, anything you buy through that link, we get a bit of that back to us. So that helps us with the podcast as well. We have our own store, and we'll have links to all this below in the description, where you can get t-shirts with some of our more well-known phrases that we say, and mugs as well. And I'm sure we'll have more variety in there at some point. And I think that's about it. Is there anything that I'm forgetting?
Well, Dan, I think the only thing left, and it's the most important thing, is for us to go find the myth that we're living.
This is the Northern Myths Podcast. Thank you for listening.